Chapter 887. Brando and Freya walked under the moonlight in the forest. The shadows of the pine trees were like a long and narrow tunnel. Their soft footsteps made rustling noises. There was a full moon above the pine needles. Owls were crying in the silent night, their sharp cries piercing through the forest. Brendel walked very quickly and Freya could barely keep up with him. She held onto the hem of her shirt with one hand to prevent it from getting caught on the uneven shrubs, but her mind was already on their linked hands and her mind was in a mess. She vaguely remembered that ever since they parted ways in Brugloss, they had not had the chance to be alone like this. The last time they walked side by side under the night sky was in the deer forest, and it was also in this forest. Brando, where are we going? You'll understand in a moment. Freya did not say anything else. Although she was a little shy, she still let Brando hold her hand tightly. The two of them advanced through the forest one after the other. It was a long but short journey. Gradually, the heavy branches parted in front of them, and the forest became sparse. Faintly, light shone through. Only then did Freya realize that they had passed through the forest from the other side, but she was full of doubts as to what was in front of them. We're here. We're still here. Brando thought in his heart. A large door opened in front of the two of them. Behind the door, there seemed to be a lively and prosperous market. This market was located at the edge of the forest. The market was dotted with lights, as if it was a banquet held by the forest fairies. Clusters of torches were lit and gathered here. But Freya saw the crooked huts and wooden houses in the market from afar. She pressed her left hand against her chest and opened her mouth slightly. She realized where she was. Ever since the War of the Black Rose, refugees from Fortress Reden and the Bucci region gathered around Brags. Some of them left this sad land and brought their families to Manowar, Kirkle and Magiton in the north. But there were always people who missed their homeland and the weak who could not move. They could not compete with the locals for land, so they could only build scattered settlements along the edge of the forest and reclaim the wastelands. Among the refugees who escaped with Brando from Fortress Reden, some of them were grateful for Brando's kindness. They followed the Redo's mercenary group to Tanajal. But those who were willing to leave their homeland were the minority. Most of them chose to stay, especially the refugees in Bucci in the north. Take a look, Freya. These are the people who placed their hopes in you. Their circumstances are not good. Go and ask them. Ask everyone who survived the catastrophe in Bucci. Did they respect you and take care of you because of your background? Brando said with some emotion. In his previous life he knew these places very well. The construction of these settlements lasted throughout his entire time as a newbie. He knew very well what kind of people lived in these huts. Freya had completely lost control of her emotions at this moment. She held Brando's hand tightly and couldn't help but cry. This was her dream home, her neighbors, the source of her ideals and beliefs. Aunt Sil, Uncle, Captain Martin, Petit Finus and everyone else. Did all of these people's trust in her come from her background? This was a question that did not need to be answered. Do you still remember the oath you made, Freya? Brando. Brando? Freya muttered to herself as if she was interrogating herself. Freya, you are Everton's daughter, but you are also Bucci's daughter. No matter what you achieve in the future, this will not change. Brando stood in the night wind and quietly replied. I understand. I should have understood. Freya closed her eyes and shook her head vigorously. I was wrong, Brando, I'm sorry. Brando patted her shoulder lightly. Bringing Freya back to see the villagers in Bucci was his original goal, but he did not expect it to happen so early. Do you want to go in and take a look? He asked softly. Freya took a deep breath and looked at Brando apologetically, then nodded vigorously. Ever since the year of blossoms and summer leaves, the continuous influx of refugees had become the biggest headache for the nobles of Brugloss. They did not have the ability nor the will to help these homeless people settle down. The local government and the army were pushing the responsibility to each other, and the refugees' livelihood was declining day by day. When the kingdom finally chose to submit to Madara, they no longer had any hope of returning home. Inside the gray-white castle, the nobles were busy fighting for power and profit. It was as if the kingdom's defeat in the war had become the sharpest spear and sword in their hands, used to pierce the chests of their opponents. A group of unlucky people fell after the war and went to the gallows, but another group of people who sang the song of victory may not be sincere about this ancient kingdom. Even at the local level, the local people, under the leadership of the manor lord, ostracized the outsiders. Although the people at the lower levels were naturally sympathetic, this sympathy was only built on the premise that their own interests were not shaken. The selfishness in human nature made the situation even worse for these poor people. They were powerless to compete with the local people for living resources, and could only enter the forest to huddle together for warmth. But even so, they still had to face the discrimination and suspicion of the local people. In such a situation, the situation of these refugees from the Wuxia region could be imagined. As a matter of fact, the refugees still had to face the uncertainty of their future. This was because the land that they relied on for survival was still the territory of one of the counts in Brugloss. In order to not cause a riot, the nobles had to pretend that they did not see the actions of these poor people. However, the count might not be satisfied with this decision. He did not care about this loss, but it could not be his loss alone. Otherwise, wouldn't he become a fool in the eyes of others? In fact, the count had already made a request to the Parliament of Nobles, requesting to drive away these bandits who had forcefully occupied his land. This kind of thing was unimaginable to ordinary people, but the Parliament of Nobles had to carefully consider the count's request. Protecting the legal property of the nobles was a serious matter. Old Martin sat beside a bonfire, wearing a well-ironed garrison uniform. It was just that the corners of his uniform had been washed so many times that they had turned white. This uniform seemed to symbolize his honor. Although it was still meticulous, it was already a thing of the past. The matters of the Parliament of Nobles had more or less reached his ears. He looked at the dark night and let out a long sigh. Sorrow seemed to have seeped into every wrinkle on this old man's forehead. That day he did not choose to leave with Brando and Freya because Wuxia was his responsibility. The matters of the young people should be left to the young people. As for him, his old bones had already experienced too much wind and frost. Let him be buried here. He could not give up his feelings for this land, and could not give up the familiar smell of Wuxia's soil. Everyone was still here, so how could he leave? But now the situation was getting worse by the day. The poor land did not produce much, and the count had forbidden the refugees from going into the forest to hunt. Although they could still chop firewood to keep warm, many people were already unable to eat. The key was that everyone lacked hope for tomorrow. It was as if they lived day by day like walking corpses. They were already numb and had lost the ability to think, hope, and look forward. When did such days begin? Every time old Martin thought of those times, his heart would become heavier. The only thing that comforted him was another rumor he had heard these days. A commotion could be heard from afar. Martin frowned. Phoenix's group of young people really did not stop. Irene, Mackie, go block their escape route. Niberto, go call your brother Vlad and Ike over. Hurry up, don't dilly-dally. The people on the street quickly retreated as if they were used to such a scene. In the empty space that they made way for, two groups of young people were facing each other in a row. On one side, they were wearing the various uniforms of the militia and the garrison. However, most of the uniforms were old and some were even covered with patches. Only the swords in their hands shone with a cold light, but most of them were numb with ropes wrapped around the sword hilts. They had either lost their gauntlets or their heavy hammers. On the other side, they were all wearing the uniform of Bragg's patrol cavalry. They were well-equipped and arrogant. Even the boots on their feet shone brightly. It was obvious that they were the children of Bragg's city. At this time, the one who was commanding the militia was Petit Finus. He was at least a head taller than a year and a half ago, and he was wearing the uniform of the garrison. After the War of the Black Rose, he was recommended by Martin to be a reserve member of the Wuxia garrison. However, not long after that, the Wuxia garrison became a part of history and completely lost its existence. Phoenix. The young patrol cavalry shouted. Count Nagin is about to take back this land. You bunch of illegal refugees, why don't you hurry up and surrender? Petit Finus spat in disdain. It's not too late to talk big after the noble parliament's discussion. Aren't you guys just trying to take advantage of this opportunity to get some benefits? I wonder who was the one who was beaten black and blue last time. You guys really forgot the pain after the scars healed. What did you say? You little bastard. The young patrolling cavalrymen were immediately hit where it hurt and started cursing. They originally thought that with their status, they would definitely be able to get rid of these country bumpkins. The last time they came out to earn some extra money, they did not expect to be caught by Little Phoenix. They were caught and given a good beating, their noses and faces were swollen. Both sides were hot-blooded youths, and would not resort to any tricks for a fight. However, this time they had finally recovered from their injuries, so they naturally called their comrades to take revenge. Both sides had the intention to fight, and because of a disagreement they started to fight. In theory, the patrolling cavalry was well-equipped and well-trained, so they should have the upper hand. However, the youths of Wuxia were not to be trifled with. Almost everyone present was Martin's student. What kind of existence was Martin? He was a veteran of the November War and even held the Candlelight Medal. None of his disciples were cowards. Not to mention Irene and Mackie, these old militia members had been on the battlefield and fought against Madara. In this kind of conflict, one of them could be used as a few people. However, the most powerful was still Petit Finus. He originally had a talent in swordsmanship, and he had also learned 2 moves from Brando. Now that he was personally taught by Martin, his swordsmanship was unparalleled in Bragg's area. The patrol cavalry obviously knew how powerful he was, so they specifically picked out 3 people to deal with him. After fighting with the 3 for a while, he suddenly freed his hand and stabbed one of them in the thigh. That person screamed and quickly threw down his sword to surrender. Although both sides were fighting, they still followed the rules. When Petit Finus saw that person throwing down his sword, he did not bother him anymore and focused on dealing with the other 2. After a few more exchanges, he risked the injury on his shoulder and knocked away another person's sword. That person looked at his sword that was knocked away, helplessly shook his head and raised his hand to surrender. The last person knew that he was no match for Petit Finus, so he quickly retreated to a large pile of boxes. Suddenly he threw a box at Petit Finus and shouted, "Hey Mr. Ogene, this kid is too powerful, come and help me." Petit Finus used his hand to block the boxes and could not help but curse. At this time he suddenly saw a sword coming towards him from the side. He was shocked, and only then did he see that the person who attacked him had already taken away the swords of a few people on his side. Unlucky, this guy is at least a captain. He quickly raised his sword to block, and with a crisp sound he almost lost his grip on his sword and let it fly out of his hand. He was shocked and realized that he had underestimated his opponent. This guy has the strength of a mid-level silver rank. But it was too late for regrets. His sword was blocked and for a moment he was wide open. Petit Finus looked at the sword coming towards him, but he was unwilling to let go of his sword. There was only one thought in his mind: "It's over, big sister brother Brando, I don't know if I will be able to see you in my next life." However, before he could close his eyes, he saw a sharp sword shining with cold light appear beside him, and with a clang, it blocked the person's sword. Then, his vision blurred, and he saw that the person who came had forced the other party to retreat with 2 consecutive strikes. The speed of the sword made him fascinated, and he never thought that swordsmanship could be so clean and neat. Before he could finish this thought, the patrolling cavalry captain's sword had already been taken away by the person who came. Then he was pressed on the chest and sent flying, landing heavily on the ground. This move shocked everyone. Both sides stopped fighting at the same time and looked in this direction. At this moment, Little Phoenix finally saw clearly who the person who had suddenly appeared in front of him was. He couldn't help but widen his eyes in shock and open his mouth wide. Big sister. Oh. Unfortunately, before he could finish his words, Freya pulled out his ear with a straight face. "Ouch, ouch, ouch. Big sister, let go." Petit Finus almost cried from the pain, but he didn't dare to resist at all. He didn't have the calmness from before, and was like a child who had done something wrong. "Aren't you promising? Why didn't you throw your sword just now?" Freya asked in a bad mood. "I was wrong, I won't do it again." Petit Finus grimaced in pain, but when he saw Brando from the corner of his eyes, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, "Brother Brando, you're back too, that's great." Freya snorted softly and let go of this guy's ear. The latter hurriedly ran far away, as if the female knight was a dragon that would devour people. Petit Finus rubbed his face and looked at the 2 people who suddenly appeared, as if he was still in a dream. At this time, both sides separated and returned to their original positions. Most of the youths in Bucci had already recognized Freya and Brando. Only a few people from the north had not seen the 2 of them. On the other hand, the patrolling cavalry was a little uncertain. Of course, they could see that Brando and Freya were obviously on the side of the country bumpkins, but the other party's swordsmanship was too frightening. Those who had seen Freya's moves before couldn't even think of resisting. When the others heard the description of their companions, most of them were also skeptical. But the captain of the knight who was knocked down by Freya noticed more details. The patrolling cavalry who ran over to help him up even asked him what to do next, but when he saw Freya's epaulette, he couldn't help but glare at the latter. "Royal Knight Regiment, Knight Captain?" His face was pale. Even in his dreams, he didn't think that this group of refugees in Bucci would have the support of the royal family. In his mind, these foreigners had no roots in this place. Even if they were bullied, they might not be able to find anyone to stand up for them. But now, not only did someone stand up for them, the other party's background was not small either. The captain of the Royal Knight Regiment, Martha, was a knight. In this kind of remote place, one might not even see one in their lifetime. Brando greeted Irene and Mackie from afar, then looked at the patrolling cavalry and asked Finus, "What's going on?" "What's going on?" Freya asked at the same time, but she immediately realized that she was thinking the same thing as Brando. She couldn't help but blush and subconsciously shut her mouth. This scene was of course seen by Petit Finus. He was still a naive youth back then, but now he had matured a lot. He couldn't help but laugh in his heart, thinking that big sister still liked big brother Brando. He looked left and right again, curious about where the witch went. Everyone in the militia knew about the relationship between Brando and the Roman, but the citizens of Bucci had always called the Roman and their aunt witches. "What are you looking at?" Freya could tell what this guy was thinking at a glance and snapped. Petit Finus was shocked and hurriedly looked down. Freya was the captain of the militia in the past, and when she was still in Bucci, Petit Finus was most afraid of this big sister, and now he was even more afraid of her. Brando looked at the relationship between the two and felt that it was funny, but he was slightly relieved that Freya had at least temporarily forgotten about her past, which was what he wanted. He was also surprised by Petit Finus. In the past, when they were escaping from Bucci, this youth only showed a little talent in swordsmanship, but now this talent was fully displayed. The battle just now had been seen by him and Freya from start to finish. Petit Finus' strength was faintly on the verge of the silver rank. This rate of growth was really terrifying. One must know that Petit Finus had been in Bucci for the past year and a half, only receiving guidance from Martin. He didn't have as many opportunities as Freya and Breton. Brando also noticed another point, and that was that the strength of this group of youths was actually above the iron rank, and many of them were already on the verge of the silver rank. This was something unimaginable in the past, but after thinking for a while, he understood that the influence of the great demonic wave was beginning to show. These thoughts ran through his mind, and he returned to the matter at hand. He smiled at Petit Finus and said, "Tell me, Petit Finus, what's going on?" Unlike Freya, Petit Finus dared to be indecent in front of her, but he was full of admiration for his big brother, Brando. Seeing that Brando had spoken, he hurriedly described the whole matter in detail, from the patrol cavalry to Earl Nakin's suggestion. Freya's face darkened when she heard it. Chapter 888. Freya's eyes were still a little red. She went to see Aunt Sil and Uncle Sil's graveyard. This graveyard was in an open space in the forest, filled with simple wooden tombstones. Most of the tombstones did not have a real owner, and were only there to comfort the souls of those who died in the war. In the square, the patrolling cavalry squatted there obediently, being looked after by the Bucci lads. However, no one made things difficult for them, and even the injured were taken care of. Brando and Martin stood together and were talking. The old man had also heard the news and rushed over, but he did not expect to meet him and Freya. This veteran of the November War, the old captain of the Bucci garrison, was very pleased with Brando and Freya's growth, especially with Brando and Freya's current status and position, which made him see hope for the people of Bucci. In fact, this old soldier had a good understanding of Erwin's noble nature. To change the situation of the people of Bucci was not a problem for the current Freya. She did not even need to trouble Brando to use his identity as Count Tonagel. Even if she was the captain of the Knight Regiment of the Royal Knight, Count Nagin would not be willing to offend her over a forest. This might sound a little sad, but to the people of Bucci, this was a matter of life and death. However, to Count Nagin this was just a matter of face. As a noble, he was not willing to be bullied by a group of refugees. However, if these refugees had the support of a close vassal by the princess' side, then it would be a different story. Freya did not even need to personally remind him. As long as the goddess of war, whose reputation was rising day by day, revealed her background in Bucci, Count Nagin would automatically withdraw his proposal in the Parliament of Nobles. The news of the fight between the patrolling cavalry and the people of Bucci quickly spread. This was not a small matter. The people of Bucci knew that this represented the views of the nobles in the city of Brags towards them. Many people came over worriedly after hearing the news. They did not know what had happened. Had the Parliament of Nobles come to a conclusion and decided to chase them away? The crowd quickly gathered and spread all kinds of rumors. Most of the people were generally sad and angry. No one opened their mouths or shouted. The scene was very oppressive because no one knew what to do next. They could only silently accumulate their anger. The patrolling cavalry on the open ground looked at this scene with fear. Only then did they realize how much trouble they had caused. Fortunately, Freya personally came out to mediate the situation. Just like what Brando said, she was the daughter of a Bucci citizen, and had once led the refugees from Fortress Reden with Brando. Many people recognized her, and when they knew that the daughter of a Bucci citizen had made a name for herself, even though they were still doubtful, at least they were slightly relieved and did not seem to be restless anymore. Brando looked at this scene and let out a sigh of relief. In history, during the month of frost in the year of the Swift, the conflict between the nobles of Brags and the refugees had intensified for 3 years. When the nobles began to chase the refugees away, the people of Bucci could not take it anymore and exploded in one night. What followed was a riot that engulfed the entire Brags region. Many people died in the disaster, and after that, the situation of the Bucci citizens worsened under the pressure of the nobles and the locals. Grimoires also suffered a great loss because of this, but the more serious disaster was that a cold suspicion was planted in the region, causing the kingdom to completely lose its prestige in the region. But today it seemed that this disaster would not repeat itself. However, when Freya returned to Brando's side, she seemed a little depressed. "Brando, this is a little different from what I imagined," she replied softly. "Do you still remember what I told you? One day you can rely on your own strength to protect Bucci, and let the people of Bucci control their own destiny, and not be at the mercy of the nobles." Brando seemed to understand what she was thinking and comforted her. "Today you have done this, and all this proves that your efforts were not in vain. You have set a goal for yourself and in the end you have fulfilled your promise." But what? But I can't help but think if I didn't have the status I have today, what would have happened? Brando, I really want the people of Bucci to be able to control their own destiny, but the power to decide everyone's destiny has only been transferred from the nobles to my hands. They may be able to live a peaceful life from now on, but even they don't realize this. If one day I want to push them into the fire pit, everything will repeat itself." Freya replied faintly. "My child, but you won't do that after all, right?" Martin replied. "I know, but..." The old man seemed to know what Freya wanted to say and interrupted her. "This is the rule of the nobles. You are one of them, so you have to abide by this rule. You have already done enough, my child." Freya pursed her lips tightly. She wanted to refute, but she didn't know what to say. She felt that there was a problem somewhere, but she didn't know what the problem was. Uncle Martin didn't seem to be wrong, but she felt very sullen in her heart. It was as if after all her hard work she didn't get the result she wanted. However, she had a faint feeling that if there was someone here who could answer her doubts, that person would be Brando. Just like every time she felt puzzled, she still looked at Brando first. "Captain Martin is right, Freya," Brando replied calmly as if this question was never a problem to him. "Under the rules of our era, this is the best way." Brando's words were like a flame that illuminated the darkness and haze in Freya's heart. She immediately reacted and raised her head asking, "Brando, do you mean that the rules can be changed?" Brando smiled at her. "Isn't this what we have been doing all along? Me, you, Her Highness and everyone else have been looking for a way forward." Freya opened her mouth slightly. Martin seemed to have understood something as well. He couldn't help but look at the young man whom he had only met twice during the War of the Black Rose. He felt that he could see more of the young man each time, but he was also surprised every time. Brando replied softly, "So Freya, you mustn't belittle yourself. You have to know that what you are doing is far more glorious and glorious than you can imagine. Your background, your talent, in front of this ideal and belief, is like a grain of sand not worth mentioning at all. Those who ridicule you, those who laugh at you, do not understand what you're thinking, because they cannot imagine the glory of Owen's ancestors. This is the great work of ordinary people, just like the oath that the late king made before his sword." "Young man," Martin listened for a long time before he spoke, "do you believe in this?" Brando nodded. "I believe without a doubt because I know that many people have sacrificed everything for this. Until now, there are still many people who have overcome obstacles for this belief and ideal. I don't dare to say whether it will succeed or fail, but at least I know that I won't let it stop halfway." He turned back and said to Freya, "Freya, do you still remember what you said before? You made an oath to fight for the destiny of independence for the people of Bucci, so that everyone who pursues happiness and beauty will one day not be manipulated by others. Do you still remember what I said to you that day?" "I remember," Freya nodded vigorously as if the haze that troubled her heart was just a thin layer of mist that would disappear with a gentle blow. She replied as if she was making an oath, "Brando, I understand. I will continue to persevere. Even if there is a day when I bleed to death, I will not regret it. Brando, do you believe in me? I will do it." "You have done it, silly girl." Brando heard Freya say that even if she bleeds to death, she will not give up. In the history of Erwin, this Valkyrie had indeed shed her last drop of blood for this ancient kingdom. Erwin's ancient glory was a scene described in legends. Martin did not dare to imagine it, but he would not easily criticize the hot-bloodedness and impulsiveness of young people. No matter what, as long as the people of Buchi could live better than today, he would be satisfied. He had seen too many of those illusory things. He gradually grew old and did not easily believe in the so-called beautiful vision, thinking that it was just a kind of illusion. But at least he understood that Freya was a good girl, and would not push the people of Buchi into the fire pit. That was enough. Buchi, who had been through so much war and pain, only wished to return to the peaceful life of the past. The crowd gradually dispersed, but the patrolling cavalrymen did not dare to act rashly. After a while, these young people finally figured out the identity of the two people in front of them. So they did not dare to act rashly, but each and every one of them cursed their bad luck in their hearts. Braggs had just experienced a war, and it was the allied forces of Tanajul, Lantanilan, and Viro that saved them from despair. However, in this war, the prestige of Count Tanajul and the Valkyrie beside Her Royal Highness was like the sun at noon. These people who were related to the army and the nobles would have heard of these two people's names. When they found out that these two people were actually from Buchi, they suddenly felt as if they had kicked an iron plate in their hearts. They did not have time to sigh for Count Nagin because compared to Count Nagin, it could be said that he was innocent because he did not know, but they had bumped into someone else. If the Count wanted to punish them, they were afraid that no one would dare to stand up for them. The patrolling cavalrymen were uneasy, but they did not expect that Brando and Freya had long forgotten about them. After all, Brando was not so petty. Moreover, he was very clear about the customs of Grimoires and even Karsuk. It was very common for hot-blooded young people to fight and even duel with each other. Both sides were relatively well behaved. Although some people were injured, basically no one killed them, and Brando was not in the mood to be harsh on them. As for the fact that these patrolling cavalrymen came to make a quick buck, it was indeed the custom, and he could not stop them even if he wanted to. Besides, he believed that with this lesson and his and Freya's background here, the patrolling cavalrymen would not make such a mistake in the future. There was no need to offend people for no reason. After all, the people of Buchi still had to live here. These young patrolling cavalrymen were mostly the descendants of the local gentry and nobles. If they really made enemies, he and Freya could not always take care of them. On the other hand, Freya did not have the intention to do so. It was rare for her to return to her hometown, and all she saw were the familiar faces, especially Petit Finus who used to be in the militia. They crowded around her and insisted that she tell them the story of her and the Count of Tanajul. However, she and Brando did not have that many stories to tell. Freya blushed and stammered for a long time without saying anything. How could she still remember the patrolling cavalryman? The patrolling cavalryman Captain Eugene waited there for a long time in fear and worry, but no one came to announce the death sentence or pardon. At first he thought that the Count deliberately left them there, but after waiting for a while he finally felt that it was not the case. It was not easy for him to find an opportunity to ask a young man from the militia. The young man's sword was taken away by Brando before, and he was very polite with his swordsmanship. That was why he came to ask Brando how to deal with these people. It was not until now that Brando remembered that there was a group of people waiting for him to deal with them. When Eugene appeared in front of him in fear and trepidation, Brando could not help but laugh. He knew these people very well. Whether it was in his previous life as a player or later in Fortress Reden, he had seen these arrogant and domineering cavalrymen with his own eyes. In the early years, the patrolling cavalrymen were a part of the kingdom's professional army that was responsible for security and defense. However, after the establishment of the garrison, the patrolling cavalrymen became the place where the nobles placed their trusted aides and arranged for their children to go out. The aristocratization of the army inevitably led to lax discipline and corruption. After the year of summer and summer leaves, the patrolling cavalrymen were basically a dispensable organization in many cities. In a border city like Braggs, the patrolling cavalrymen could still maintain basic combat strength, but in the cities that were deep within the borders, they were just a group of pure vermin. In fact, the reason why he had forgotten about these fellows was that he had subconsciously thought that these fellows had already escaped. However, he had forgotten that in front of a count with real power, it seemed that these patrolling cavalrymen would not dare to leave without asking him, no matter how bold they were. When Eugene first saw Brando, he was a little surprised. He probably did not expect the legendary Count to be so young. However, he thought of other rumors about this Count Tanajul. For example, he was the grandson of Sword Saint Darius, and some rumors about him and the princess. He felt relieved. Besides, people often said that this Count was Erwin's rare young genius. Only someone like him deserved the title of a young genius. He quickly coughed and straightened his posture. He lowered his head and bowed. Count, today's matter is actually a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Brando was still thinking about how this guy would apologize, but he did not expect it to be such a boring old trick. He could not help but yawn and ask, "What misunderstanding?" "It's like this, my lord," Eugene quickly said. "Everyone thinks that we are here to help Count Nakin drive them out of here. This is actually a pure rumor. Let's not talk about driving everyone out of the forest. This is just a rumor. Besides, even if it's true, this is not within the scope of our duties. In fact, my lord, we are here for other official business." "Other official business?" "My lord, earlier we heard a report that a group of vicious criminals appeared in Bragg's. These guys left the city around evening. Later, our spies found them in the vicinity, so I followed them all the way here." "Let me guess. Then, you bumped into Little Phoenix and the others, so you fought on the way, right?" Eugene nodded embarrassedly. Of course, he could shirk all responsibility, but he knew that he might not be able to deceive the young count. He might as well tell the truth to avoid offending him. Brando nodded. He roughly understood the cause and effect of the matter. These people searched all the way here and then encountered Petit Finus and his men. There was already a grudge between the two sides, so the patrolling cavalry wanted to seize the opportunity to take revenge in one fell swoop. This was a more reasonable explanation. Brando was very clear that the so-called mission was nothing to these descendants of nobles. As for the so-called vicious criminals, it would be considered a merit if they caught them. If they couldn't catch them, then so be it. After all, they didn't lack the so-called merit. However, he was a little curious about the existence of the so-called vicious criminals. In theory, there were already a lot of criminals in Bragg's. In order to attract the attention of the patrolling cavalry, there were at least two conditions. First, they must not be local. The local criminals were mostly related to the Thieves' Brotherhood or other gray organizations. These organizations were usually inextricably linked to the local nobles. Therefore, the patrolling cavalry generally wouldn't find trouble with their own people. Although Brando couldn't explain why the patrolling cavalry and the criminals were on the same side, this could be considered as the scenery of Erewhon in this era. Second, there must be a certain number of criminals. One or two criminals wouldn't attract the attention of the patrolling cavalry. It wasn't that they didn't want to care, but with their efficiency, they probably wouldn't notice the existence of one or two criminals. And the current situation clearly indicated that a large group of criminals had sneaked into the city, so much so that even the patrolling cavalry was alerted. No matter how Brando thought about it, he felt that it was a little like the way the cultists did things. But when he asked about this matter, Petit Finus seemed to have heard something. He ran over and said, "Brother Brando, I think I know these guys." "You know?" Brando looked at him curiously. Chapter 889. "I don't know where those guys came from. They sounded like Erdek or smugglers from Greywater Bay. In short, they were probably from that area. There were about a dozen of them. Most of them were the ones mentioned above, but 2 or 3 of them were different. They were taller and spoke like the locals. Once, Niberto noticed that they were all using the same saber, the kind that was longer and thinner, with a relief of 2 wings on the guard. These guys live in an abandoned hunter's camp in the forest. They rarely go out and don't interact much with outsiders. They have been there for at least half a month. At first, Captain Martin sent people to keep an eye on them, but we found that their range of activity was very narrow and they didn't have much interaction with us. So after a while, no one paid them any attention. These people aren't particularly strong. Of course, there may be 1 or 2 of them who are a little troublesome, but there's nothing to be afraid of. I heard that the abandoned hunter's camp was left behind before the war. The original owner had long fled to the north, so it was abandoned. The camp isn't far from here. After entering the forest, head south. After about an hour and a half, you'll see a path that leads to that place." According to Petit Finus' description, Brando led, or rather escorted, the group of patrolling cavalry into the forest. The first full moon, Goldsea, had already fallen below the horizon. The second moon, Moya, had just risen above the mountains. The gray moon hung in the sky. They moved south along the foot of the hillside illuminated by the slanting moon. A small path passed through the twisted bushes, and it didn't take long for them to find the hunter's camp. The moon was very bright that night. They could clearly see that the camp was located in a call from a few miles away. Brando stood in the woods at the top of the hill and looked at the hunter's camp. He confirmed with Petit Finus beside him, "Is it there?" Soon he got an affirmative answer. "It's there, Brother Brando." Petit Finus whispered, "Captain Martin used to bring us here for training, but the skeletons made too much of a ruckus some time ago, so this place was taken over by others." He continued to brag. To be honest, if it wasn't for Captain Martin telling us not to cause any trouble, I would have brought some men to chase them away. Those guys don't look like good people at first glance. Ouch! Freya retracted her hand that had knocked on Petit Finus's head, and looked at him in annoyance. After not seeing him for more than a year, this little guy had already replaced her as the new leader of Butchie's militia. Irene and Mackie were more mature than him, but the young people preferred a capable leader. If they were still in Butchie, this little brat would never have dared to be so careless. He actually dared to bring everyone to fight. Freya was furious when she thought of this. In the past, the Butchie militia under her leadership was not synonymous with causing trouble. Although the young patrolling cavalrymen were all frowning, they couldn't help but snicker at this moment. Petit Finus rubbed his red forehead and looked at them, feeling that his self-esteem had been hurt. He angrily said, "What, do you think I don't have the ability?" "Of course not, Mr. Petit Finus, we admire you very much." "Yes, yes." The patrolling cavalryman hurriedly replied. Jean also complimented. "The Count's little friend's talent in swordsmanship is amazing. One day he will definitely become extraordinary." Brando looked at Petit Finus and agreed with this point. In this era, Butchie had produced two outstanding people. One was Freya, the other was Breton, but Petit Finus's talent in swordsmanship far surpassed the two of them. He didn't know if this young man had died in Butchie, but Erwin's name did not shine after that. "Petit Finus, what do you plan to do in the future?" Brando asked. "Captain Martin wants to recommend me to the Manowir region's garrison. He has some old friends there who can help." Petit Finus did not hide anything from Brando. "That's good." Brando nodded noncommittally. "What do you think?" Petit Finus stared at him. "Brother Brando, I want to learn swordsmanship from you." For some reason, Brando suddenly thought of Haruz and nodded silently. This was actually an idea that he suddenly had before. When he saw Petit Finus's outstanding talent in swordsmanship, he had the idea that he couldn't let such a bright pearl be left in this place to collect dust. The name Petit Finus didn't exist in history, but there must be a place for this young man in this world. He had this premonition when he first left Butchie, but looking back now, Erwin might have missed a real genius. In time, Petit Finus could grow into a sword saint like his grandfather. When Brando thought so, he didn't consider that his current reputation had a tendency to inherit Darius's position, especially in the noble circle. Many people already knew that Darius had a grandson who was only in his early 20s, but had already achieved elemental activation and the strength of a sword saint. After Anson's era, Erwin would have a real sword saint in the blink of an eye. "Brother Brando, you agreed?" Petit Finus cried excitedly. "Brando, don't spoil him too much," Freya couldn't help but interject. "Captain's arrangement must have his reasons. I think you'd better ask Uncle Martin first." "Big Sister Freya, you can't help outsiders." "Hey, tell me how I'm helping outsiders. Brando is not an outsider." "For Big Sister, Big Brother Brando is indeed not an outsider, so I've misspoken." Ew. Freya was almost angered to death by Petit Finus's words. Brando smiled as he watched the siblings bicker, feeling as if he had returned to Butchie. He didn't care about Freya's worries at all. Martin arranged for Petit Finus to join the garrison at Manowir because he didn't know about his and Freya's situation. Now that they had returned to Butchie, he was afraid that Martin would come to him without him saying anything. The veteran who participated in the November War would know where Petit Finus had a better future. He then looked at the hunters' camp in the valley. He didn't come here on a whim to pretend to be Braggs's security officer, but Petit Finus's description of those people caught his attention. There were about 10 of them. Most of them were the ones mentioned above, but there were 2 or 3 of them that were different. They were taller and their accent was more like the locals. Once, Niberto noticed that they were all using the same sword, the kind that was longer and thinner, with 2 wings embossed on the hilt. This is a typical cavalry sword. Only one type of person in Grenoirs would use this kind of sword, and that is the white-winged cavalry. The decorations on the sword also prove this point. So, these 3 people are most likely deserters. Thinking back to Terst's last words last night, Brendel's heart was suddenly filled with a sense of vigilance. He wanted to investigate this matter thoroughly. However, he didn't tell Freya and Petit Finus since it was just a guess. The group quickly approached the camp, and Brando ordered the patrolling cavalry to surround the entire camp. Perhaps it was because they wanted to show off, or perhaps it was because the young men from Braggs really did have some skills, but under Eugene's lead, they quietly spread out and quickly took control of the camp. When they got closer, they could see a few scattered wooden houses scattered in the forest. A wooden wall about the height of a person surrounded the camp, but the wall was tattered and full of holes. The camp was overgrown with weeds, and it looked like no one had taken care of it for a long time. This point alone showed that these people didn't plan to stay here for long. In this era, refugees were basically fugitives. Eugene looked around and told Brando, "These people actually came back. How bold of them. I thought they would at least move to another place." With Brando's sharp senses, he could naturally hear 12 breathing sounds in the house. He thought to himself, as expected of someone in charge of law and order. He looked at the patrolling cavalry captain curiously and asked, "How did you know?" Eugene looked at the count strangely and pointed to the second house. Brando looked and couldn't help but cough lightly. It turned out that there was a person on night watch sitting in front of the door. He patted his head lightly. He was so focused on listening to the sounds that he didn't notice that there was a bandit right in front of him. This was too embarrassing. He quickly shut his mouth and put on a solemn expression so that others wouldn't see that he, the Count, had made a fool of himself. Brando listened carefully for a while and found that it was as Petit Finus had said. These people's strength was very ordinary. The person on night watch was about the upper level of iron, and the others were about the same level as him. There was a silver-ranked person in the third house. Because they were too far away, Brando couldn't tell what level he was at, but he probably wouldn't be above the middle level. After making this judgment, he felt a little disappointed. These people were too weak. Even if they were cultists, they probably wouldn't be any core members. In Wonde, these types of fugitives were not rare. They often roamed around to commit crimes, murder or other sensational crimes. However, their world obviously didn't have much interaction with him. After confirming this, Brando shook his head disappointedly and made a gesture to the patrolling cavalry. That gesture was meant to tell the patrolling cavalrymen how many people were in the house, where they were, and what their strengths were. This was a common tactical gesture used by the patrolling cavalrymen, and Brando was able to use it so easily. Eugene was also surprised when he saw this. Could it be that this Count was also a patrolling cavalryman? Of course, he didn't think that Brando would be a low-level underling like them. He thought that Brando was most likely a high-ranking commander or a Grand Knight. However, he didn't know that his first thought was closer to the truth. Although these cultists were just a few thieves, Brando didn't plan to let them go. He didn't plan to do it himself. Instead, he wanted to give the credit to the young patrolling cavalry. After all, these young men had accompanied him for half a night in the wilderness. They should at least get some benefits even if they didn't do it willingly. Under Brando and Eugene's instructions, the young patrolling knight immediately took action. They first sneaked into the camp and quietly killed the night watchman. Just like what Eugene said, these cultists were frighteningly bold. There was only one night watchman in the entire camp, and even that night watchman was actually dozing off. They obviously didn't expect the patrolling cavalry to come to their lair. It was only when the young patrolling cavalry entered the third house that they woke up the cultists. The battle almost immediately broke out. The silver-ranked cultist was the first to react. He grabbed his sword and pounced on the patrolling cavalry. Eugene followed suit with his sword. The two of them clashed with their swords, but no one could do anything to the other. It was obvious that the leader of the patrolling cavalry was a tough nut to crack. Unfortunately, this guy's men were useless. They fell one by one under the siege of the patrolling knight. In the end, only the leader of the cultists was left fighting alone in the house. He probably knew that there was no hope for him to break out of the encirclement. He suddenly let out a roar, turned the tip of his sword, and stabbed it into his own throat. He fell to the ground dead. The battle ended faster than expected. Brando was a little surprised by the strength of the patrolling knight, but he soon understood. The current situation did not show how strong the kingdom's patrolling cavalry was. On the contrary, it was precisely because of the poor performance of the patrolling cavalry that these outlaws dared to act so boldly. They obviously did not expect the local security team made up of nobles to attack them in the middle of the night. If Brando did not let them witness the truth, they would have thought it was a fantasy. However, the young patrolling knights were apparently unaware of this. They happily dragged the bandits out of the house one by one as long as they were still breathing. Little Phoenix did not want to be left behind, so he naturally caught one of them with his own hands. The cultists were lined up in a row outside the camp. There were only 5 of them left. Most of the others had their throats slit in their sleep. Brando glanced at the 2 taller ones among the 5. He paid special attention to the swords that were thrown in front of them. Just as Petit Finus said, they were the swords of the white-winged cavalry. As for the third person, Brando knew that he was probably dead. Did you get anything out of them? He turned to ask Eugene. Eugene smiled and shook his head at Brando. He was slightly older than the young men under him, but he was only in his 30s. According to Won's calculation, he was still young. Moreover, he was the captain of the patrolling cavalry. His men had found out that these people were all cultists of the All for One. This was a great achievement. They had captured 12 cultists in one fell swoop, and 5 of them were still alive. Not to mention, 3 of them were deserters of the white-winged cavalry. Jean could almost see a medal waving at him. He smiled and replied to Brando, "Count, these guys are all cultists. They are very stubborn and won't say anything. But it doesn't matter. They are going to die anyway. Once they are sent back, they won't be hanged until next week. When the time comes, I will book a better stand and invite you to see it in person." Brando had no interest in watching the hanging. He shook his head, but he also understood that what Jean said was not wrong. Most of the members of the All for One, from the outlaws to the nobles like Erek, were obsessed and would never turn back. They probably understood that once their identities were exposed, death was the only thing waiting for them. So they did not have any hopes of getting away. But this meant that he had wasted his trip tonight. Just as he was thinking about this, a young patrolling knight suddenly ran out of the house. He waved something in his hand and shouted excitedly, "My lord, I found another piece of evidence." When the guy came closer, Brando saw that he was holding a map. He opened it up in front of Jean as if he was presenting a treasure. Brando immediately understood why the guy was so excited. The map should be the streets of Bragg's castle. It was very detailed and was a typical military map. Brando looked at the 2 wings on the map and understood that this was probably a map used by the white-winged cavalry. Privately collecting military maps was a serious crime in this era, not to mention stealing it from the army. Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. At the same time, he felt Freya gently touch his hand. Freya also understood military maps. She saw that there were 2 shallow red circles on the map. One of them was marked on Gravedigger Street 52. "Brando," she whispered. Brando understood and immediately whispered in her ear, "Freya, go and call Amandina over." "Amandina, she..." Brando nodded. He thought that he had guessed wrongly, but he did not expect that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel. The deserters of the white-winged cavalry in front of him, the leader of the white-winged cavalry, Medshk Turst's last cry, and the map. A line of light and dark appeared in front of him. But he felt that it was strange. Why were the members of the Unifying Guild always pestering Amandina? What could a noble like her have that would be of interest to them? Brando thought about it carefully and shook his head in confusion. This matter was very strange. Turst and Medshk were members of the upper echelons of the Unifying Guild. Logically speaking, a matter of their level should not be handled by these cannon fodders. What was going on here? Thinking up to here, he patted Jin's shoulder. "Captain, I hope that you can do me a favor." "What favor?" Jin was slightly startled as he looked at the Count. "I think that these people's identities are not as simple as they appear on the surface. I suggest that you don't send them to Bragg's prison first. Instead, find a place to interrogate them properly." Brando replied. Jin hesitated for a moment before nodding. Compared to Emerit, he was more unwilling to offend Brando. Brando smiled. "Thank you very much, Captain. Don't worry, the merit will definitely belong to you and your subordinates." Jin was elated when he heard Brando thanking him. He thought that he had made the right decision this time. Chapter 890. When Freya returned to the manor, it was already late at night, but Amandina had been waiting for this moment after sending the youth away. When she heard Freya's description, she understood what had happened. She was a little surprised, thinking that it was such a coincidence. With her astuteness and intelligence, she immediately thought that the people that Brendel had captured were probably the same group of outlaws that Diane had encountered. She asked Freya to wait for a while, then went back to the house to get the shawl and the necklace without the pendant, and then set off to meet up with Brando. When the 2 of them arrived at the hunter's camp, the patrolling knights wasted another 2 to 3 hours in vain, and still did not get a single word out of the cultists. They searched the hunter's camp again and again, almost turning it upside down, before they found a 16-page black-covered book called the Codex of All Things, and a wooden statue with a coiled serpent carved on it. The statue was obviously often used in various kinds of ceremonies, and its surface had long been polished smooth, but it was very clean, and there was not a trace of dirt on it. It was a stark contrast to the filthy and unkempt outlaws. As for the Codex of All Things, Jean took a glance at it and hurriedly threw it aside. This was a forbidden book that the Holy Cathedral of Fire prohibited from reading and spreading, and he seemed to be afraid that the book would come alive and bite him and cause him trouble. But the young men under him were more careful. They first opened the Codex of All Things and flipped through a few pages to make sure that there was nothing inside. Then they fumbled around the cover and opened it up. In the end, they really did pull out a thin piece of parchment, but it was a pity that there was nothing on the parchment. The patrolling knights tried all kinds of methods, whether it was dripping a potion on it, roasting it with fire, or putting it under the moonlight, but there was no way to make the parchment show any words. Brando tried a few small magic tricks, but to no avail. In the end, he could only put it aside. At first, the young patrolling cavalrymen were full of energy, determined to show off in front of the count. But after a few hours they couldn't help but yawn. The cultists seemed to be made of special materials. No matter how they were tortured and wailed, they did not say a word. They even killed one of them as an example. The rest of the cultists were trembling in fear, but they still gritted their teeth and refused to speak. Compared to death, they were more afraid of the torture after death. These people had already dedicated their souls to the devil and the dusk. Once they opened their mouths and fell into hell, what awaited them was a fate worse than death. After the gloomy Moya sunk into the horizon from the mountains in the east, Tadessa, who only appeared in the autumn night sky, was halfway through the journey. The stars in the north and the south changed. There was only a short period of time left in the night. Everyone was exhausted, but they still got nothing. Jean couldn't help but look at Brando a little apologetically, but Brando said that it was fine. He was lucky, but this result was also expected. He looked at the young people who looked like frosted eggplants. Although he knew that they were just flattering him, he was still very satisfied. He planned to wait until dawn to search the camp one last time. If it didn't work, he would think of another way. These people would always leave some clues. And it was at this time that Amandina, accompanied by Freya, finally arrived at the camp. Amandina was very smart. When she saw the messy camp and the young people of the patrol team who seemed to have not slept for at least a week, she knew that the Lord was so troubled because of her. Otherwise, why would he have to make things difficult for a group of insignificant cultists? He was not Braggs's sheriff, and the sheriff might not personally care about these trivial matters. She bowed slightly to Brando, and then asked him about the story of the night. She first glanced at the cultists to make sure that she had never met them before, and then checked the scattered things found in the camp one by one. But when she heard Brando mention the blank parchment, she looked up and said to Brando, "My lord, let Captain Jean send these outlaws away first. As you can see, they probably won't talk." Brando glanced at Amandina. The two of them had worked together for quite some time, and he could already hear some hidden meaning in her words, so he nodded. The patrolling cavalrymen hurriedly tied up the remaining living people with ropes. Of course, they also tied up the dead people. No matter if they were still breathing or dead bodies lying on the ground, it was still their credit. Since the easygoing count had already expressed that he would give them the credit, they naturally wouldn't be polite. Although they might not really need the credit, a cultist could be exchanged for a lot of bounty, enough for them to squander. When the patrol team was busy, Amandina pulled Brando and Freya aside and whispered, "My lord, I think I know why they are here." Brando was slightly startled and looked at his Amandina with some confusion. Amandina looked at him and then told the two of them what happened to Dian. Then she said, "My lord, do you still remember the will my father left behind?" Brando nodded. "Martha above, I may not be alive for long. If someone is lucky enough to see this will of mine after my death, I am willing to legally transfer all my belongings to this person. In addition, I also have a secret ancestral property. I am willing to divide this wealth into 3 parts. One part will be given to this person, one part will be given to my wife, Sadie, and one part will be left to my daughter." Amandina thought for a moment and recited the contents of the will word by word as if she was reading it. "If the person who sees this will be interested in this wealth, please pass this will and my keepsake to my wife. Also tell her about the date at the Baden ball. She will understand what I want to express." In the end, she stopped and read for a while in silence. "Finally, I am sorry to Sadie. May Lady Martha punish me." Brando looked at Amandina and knew that she would not do anything unnecessary. He waited for her to continue. Amandina took a light breath. "When my father was young, he was very poor for a period of time. He met my mother at a ball at that time and they fell in love very quickly. At that time they bought a mansion in the old town of Braggs. The courtyard where I was born was bought after my father earned some money. I think I know where my father left his inheritance." Brando couldn't help but laugh. Amandina was always so serious. He was short of money at that time, so he valued her father's will. But no matter how much inheritance Borg Nesson left behind, it was just a drop in the bucket for Tanajul. He was just a small noble. "Amandina, since you remember where your father's inheritance is, then think of a way to find it. It's good to have it as a souvenir." He suddenly stopped and looked at Amandina with surprise. You're saying that these people are after your father's inheritance? Amandina nodded her head lightly. This could explain part of the problem. Only these low-level cultists would care about this small amount of money. They might have gotten wind of it from somewhere and wanted to make a fortune. But it could not explain why Turst and Medjk were after it. Perhaps they did not care about the same thing. But Brando looked at the two white-winged cavalry deserters who were tied up. Their relationship with Medjk was not a coincidence. He knew that his guess was not correct. If only they could speak, it would be good. But it was impossible. Amandina looked at her lord's deep frown and said softly, "My lord, I think I might have some clues about that blank parchment." "You have a way." Brando came back to his senses. Amandina shook her head. "It's just a guess. I'll have to take a look to be sure." The parchment was placed together with the Codex of All Things, sandwiched between the pages of the book. Brendel asked a young man to bring the forbidden book over. Amandina opened it and took out the parchment. She flattened it out, and her eyes revealed a look of understanding. She hesitated for a moment, then said to Brando with some hesitation, "My lord, this is a letter. I think I can make the words appear on it, but can you let me do this alone?" "A letter?" Brando was slightly surprised. He looked at Amandina with some doubts in his heart, but he still nodded. "Thank you, my lord." Amandina was grateful. Brando did not ask her what she wanted to do. This was a silent trust that made her feel satisfied and gratified. She excused herself from Brando and took the parchment to a wooden house. She raised her hands to the back of her neck and took off the necklace hanging around her neck. The necklace still had the key to the house 52 on Gravedigger Street. She laid the parchment and the necklace on the ground. Then she knelt down and bit her finger, dripping blood on the necklace where the pendant originally hung. At this time, a miraculous scene occurred. The blood flowed down the necklace and floated in the air, outlining the outline of a crystal. This imaginary crystal emitted a faint light. Amandina shone the light on the parchment, and lines of words gradually appeared on the parchment. Amandina looked at the words and sighed. She waited until the blood on the necklace gradually dissipated, then put the parchment back on and carefully covered the necklace with her shawl. Brando waited for a little while for Amandina to come out. She walked to his side and handed the parchment to him. "Did it work?" Brando asked. Amandina nodded gently. Amandina, he looked at her carefully. Amandina might have some little secrets that others did not know, but Brando believed that she would not harm him, so he did not ask any more questions. Everyone had their own secrets and he respected Amandina's choice. He opened the parchment and hurriedly glanced at the first two paragraphs on it. He raised his eyebrows slightly. There was a special purple text on the letter that read, "Dear Pomide, my brother, we have never been so close to the truth, and the fragmented riddles have gradually formed a complete picture in front of me. I have taken good care of the Marshal's relics, and now I will set out to find the truth. I believe that one day you and I and everyone else will be treated justly. For 30 years, the nightmarish images that you and I witnessed in that place have haunted my mind, but to this day I am convinced that the choice we made that day was one of justice and selflessness, and I shall soon prove it. I believe that the Marshal may object to the princess's request, but there are some things that we have to do. You, I, and the county have long agreed to keep this promise, and I have received this honor to preserve a part of the evidence. I am sure that in the near future, it will become an honorable witness. In addition, I have sealed a part of the fragments in the same place, as part of my legacy for my descendants. Because you and I both know this, what we are about to accomplish is full of unknowns and dangers. I think that if I were to meet with misfortune one day, these pieces of the puzzle would be preserved through my wife's hands. Oh yes, we have not written to each other for many years, and I forgot to tell you that I am married. My wife, Sadie, is the most beautiful girl in the world. I love her as much as I love myself, my parents, and the people I respect the most in the world. If possible, I hope that you can meet her. You will definitely fall in love with her. She is a quiet and gentle girl, knowledgeable, intelligent, and reserved. Sometimes I wish that she was the only princess in the world and I am her knight. But I am often away from home and I owe her too much and I feel very guilty about it. Sadie and I already have a child of our love. She is my daughter and I named her Amandina. Amandina is the Elvish word for flower of hope. My daughter looks very much like my wife, but I believe that she will become a knight in the future like me. She is very clever and has been able to see this since she was a child. I can see it in her eyes, a light of wisdom that I have only seen in the eyes of Her Royal Highness, and I am sure of it. I often think that if Lord Scott had a son, he could marry Amandina to him. They would be the brightest stars in Erwin's future. Haha, you will think that I am dreaming, but I have long heard that Lord Scott is already married just like me. His betrothal is to the beautiful and gentle Lady Cartier. It is a pity that I do not know where they are staying, or I would have attended their wedding. Think about it, what an honor it would be. Finally, I hope that you will always be healthy and strong as an ox. I hope that everything we do will be worthy of the Marshal, Her Highness, and everyone involved. May the black pine be evergreen, and may Erwin live forever. May the faith shine as it was in the beginning, and may the sword be as sharp as ever. Since the year of the water harp, I have missed your shepherd, your brother. Brando carefully read the last sentence before he raised his head and looked at Amandina in front of him. Amandina's face was slightly red, and it was obvious that she had read the whole letter before. She was a little embarrassed and she whispered, "Please don't mind, my lord. That is just my father's wishful thinking. You and Her Highness have another engagement, and there is also the Roman lady. You can just think of it as a kind joke. Originally, this letter was not a big deal. Anyone could see that it was just a family letter, and the contents could be seen as a joke between family members. But after all, it was through her hands and she felt that there was something different about it. Amandina was a little uneasy, wondering if the Lord would think that she had played some little tricks in it. But in fact the onlooker saw more clearly. Brando did not care about this matter at all. He was more concerned about the other contents of the letter. He looked at Amandina and smiled bitterly. "Amandina, this is the letter your father left, right?" Amandina was startled and nodded subconsciously. "Do you know this person, shepherd?" Amandina shook her head this time. She frowned and showed a thoughtful expression, but after a moment she shook her head gently. "Your father's real name is Shepherd, isn't it?" Brando asked. He had never heard of this name. After all, this was a story from 40 or 50 years ago. The history of this period in the game was just a passing mention. Amandina trembled slightly and then nodded gently. "Maybe so. He may have mentioned it to me once or twice. My father is from Cypher. In their place, from children to adults, they usually have two names. In private, brothers and family members often use the name that belonged to children as a nickname." Brando thought for a moment, and it seemed to be true. He looked at the letter in his hand and had a general outline in his mind. Based on the contents of the letter, Amandina's father and his grandfather might have some sort of relationship. Based on the titles in the letter, Amandina's grandfather should be from the same generation as Amandina's father and Seal. That Pamid was obviously one of the officers, and he might even be one of Amandina's trusted subordinates. This was greatly beyond his expectations. He never thought that there would be such a connection between him and Amandina. In the past he never believed in fate, but now he could not help but believe in it. It was as if there was an invisible line connecting him and Amandina together. Chapter 891. There was a silence between the two of them, as if they were both thinking about the same question. After a while Brando asked, "Amandina, do you know what your father did before?" Amandina shook her head. "I'm not sure. Since the day I could remember, my life was peaceful and comfortable, no different from other families of our social class. In Braggs, my father had several properties, and his source of income was stable before he disappeared. I only know that my father had a hard time when he was young, but my mother and father did not tell me the specifics." Brando pursed his lips. He was thinking about a few things. What was the truth and fragmented riddles that gradually formed the picture that the letter referred to? What did they experience with his grandfather? Who was the princess that was mentioned in the letter? He was sure that it was not Griffine, since she and Haruz were not even born at that time. Lastly, why would these insignificant cultists have such a letter? The unifying guild was very secretive, and it was unlikely that Medshk and Turst would give such an important thing to a group of minions. These fugitives carefully placed the letter into the cover of the Codex of All Things, clearly knowing the value of this letter. "Amandina," Brando waved the letter, "do you think they can find a way to see the contents of this letter?" He was obviously referring to the cultists. Amandina looked over and shook her head decisively. "They can't see it. The only way to make this letter appear is my father's family's unique method." "That's right," Brando suddenly remembered. "How did you recognize this letter?" Amandina was stunned for a moment before she answered, "Because my father left a special mark on the letter. This mark can hide from them, but it can't hide from me." "But you haven't seen this parchment before, have you?" Brando was a little confused. Amandina opened her mouth and was stunned for a moment before she answered, "My lord, Dean told me that these people broke into my house and found my father's old house in San Juan district, and I was already suspicious at that time. I think they probably obtained information about my father's inheritance through some means, and that's how the letter ended up in their hands. It's just that they don't have to understand this letter, otherwise they wouldn't have wasted their efforts. Brando pressed his hand on the parchment, his attention drawn by Amandina's words. You said they wasted their efforts. You already knew that your father's inheritance wasn't there. By the way, where did you say your parents first lived? In the old city in the Grey Rat Street. Brando and Amandina discussed while Freya and Petit Finus assisted the patrolling knights in monitoring the restless cultists. After a night of torment, the sky in the east was faintly white, and a new day had arrived when Tedessa sank into the horizon. The patrolling knights cleared out the hunters' camp before dawn, and Eugene repeatedly thanked Brando before he left. The captain of the patrolling knights was extremely respectful, as if compared to this small merit, being able to establish a relationship with the count was more important. Brando did not expose him but instead thanked him sincerely. The two sides separated outside the forest. The young patrolling knights had a good impression of the count who did not put on airs, and repeatedly told him that he must go and observe the execution of these outlaws. Brando did not understand why these people were so interested in the execution, as if it was some kind of entertainment instead of killing people. Eugene also promised that he would persuade the Parliament of Nobles to give him a bronze Starflame medal, but the Starflame medal was already widespread after Anson's era, and was not as precious as the Candlelight medal that only the royal family and the Holy Cathedral of Fire were qualified to give out. The old part of Grey Rat Street had been completely renovated after the year of the Howling War. It had been incorporated into the public cemetery, and it was not too far away from Amandina's residence on Gravedigger Street. It was just a street that faced the underground crypt, and was cold and deserted even during the day. The public cemetery was located behind a temple that belonged to the Grim Reaper, and the temple sat quietly at the intersection of the Grey Rat Street and the Gravedigger Street. Brando asked Dien and to bribe the monks in the temple to allow them to enter the public cemetery to take a look. The old monk in a grayish-brown frock led them through a large and small corridor supported by countless arches, and then through a small door to the back of the temple. After passing through a forest, they entered the range of the public cemetery. It was a quiet place surrounded by trees, and the open space between the arches of the trees had many nameless or famous tombstones. A few stone paths surrounded it, leading to the unknown depths of the forest filled with fog. He's not worried about us? Freya could not help but ask in surprise when she saw the old monk return to the temple and close the door. He's just a coward. I've heard that there are many legends about this graveyard. I've heard that there are many strange things wandering around in the forest. Every year people are killed in this area. Little Phoenix replied with disdain. It's not that scary. That's just to deceive outsiders because there are people who want to use this layer of disguise to do illegal things here. Murder, secret transactions, whispers in the forest are all plots and schemes. In fact, these old monks are the ones who know best. After listening to Petit Finus's words, Dienan replied with a smile, anyway, as long as someone pays, they don't care what we do. But they're not afraid? Even though she had seen a lot, Freya still found it hard to believe. These are all public secrets. Tomb robbers and corpses are sold. There are even necromancers who secretly buy corpses from the monks to use as research materials. There is a huge underground black market here. How could the monks not know? Freya sighed softly with some disgust. What a blasphemy. The necromancers also believe in Martha, don't they? Dienan replied indifferently. Freya frowned and glanced at him. The young man realized that he seemed to have said something wrong and quickly added, those monks are inextricably linked to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even the nobles don't want to provoke them. Besides, the nobles have their family tombs. If they don't want to interfere, what can we do? Those necromancers are mostly members of the Grey Domain. Ordinary people don't dare to offend them. Freya knew that he was telling the truth. Although she was unwilling to listen, she just frowned and did not speak. She clenched her teeth tightly. If the old monk appeared in front of her again, she would pull out her sword and stab him in the heart. Brando's face was expressionless. What Dienan said was common to him, but it was not entirely true that there was no danger in this cemetery. Normal places would not be as foggy and gloomy as this place in broad daylight. The visibility was not more than 10 meters. The surroundings were surrounded by trees as if the sun could not penetrate it. It was just past noon, but the cemetery seemed to be in the evening. It was even cloudy. The supernatural mysteries came from the underground. There was an even bigger graveyard there, Bruglas's underground public graveyard. Danger lurked in every corner, filled with zombies and moving skeletons. Ever since the year of howling, not many people dared to go down there. But that was not their goal today. He asked Amandina, who was beside him. Amandina, are you sure it's here? The temperature in the cemetery was a few degrees lower than outside. Amandina's face was a little pale from the cold. She pressed on her shawl and whispered, "The nearby residential area was demolished 20 years ago and turned into a cemetery. But I heard that the house my parents originally rented was luckily preserved. There's a gravekeeper living there." "There's a gravekeeper here?" Freya was slightly surprised. She thought that this place was completely lawless. At least in name. Amandina was a local after all. She had more or less heard what Dienen said, but she did not want to talk about it. She frowned and said, "I heard that he helped the grave diggers transport the corpses out. He runs this shady business." Business? Freya almost fainted from anger. Brendel heard her clenching her teeth so hard that they made a grinding sound. It did not take long for them to find the gravekeeper's house. Amandina still remembered the direction, and Dienen could also find the place. They passed through the lush forest and many tombstones, and saw a 2-story wooden house in the fog. It stood alone in the depths of the forest. Dienen had already contacted the gravekeeper. Naturally, the gravekeeper did not know Brando's identity, but when he heard that a noble had come, he thought that he had found a big deal and was waiting respectfully in front of the house. The gravekeeper was called Old Sly. His real name had long been forgotten, like a skeleton buried in the ground. He looked exactly like Brando's impression of this profession. It was as if he had met a living demon. He had a hunched back and a hunched body, similar to the strange Quasimodo in Notre Dame de Paris. The only difference was that the latter had a noble heart, while the former was full of evil tricks. It was hard to tell his age. His face was full of wrinkles, but his eyes were lively, as if they were constantly spinning with sinister thoughts. His head was bald, and only a few strands of hair were left standing lazily, as if they were a miniature copy of the forest in the fog. Freya looked at the man coldly, but Brando was too lazy to make things difficult for such a small person. In fact, these people might not be willing to do these shady businesses. He understood that in this era where everyone more or less lost something, the blame should not be placed on one person's head. Otherwise it would be purely to vent one's anger. But this did not mean that he was willing to deal with this kind of person. He looked at the man and did not even bother to exchange greetings. He directly asked, "You already know what we want, right?" The gravekeeper hurriedly nodded and bowed, respectfully handing over a bunch of keys to Brando. This was what Dienen had told him. Although he did not know what this young noble wanted to do with his house, he at least knew Dienen. The young man had given him a large sum of money. Naturally, the money did not belong to Dienen. He was very clear that he could not ask too much about anything in this place. Who knew what this noble wanted to do? The more he knew, the more dangerous it would be. Moreover, nobles had some strange fetishes. He secretly glanced at the 2 beautiful girls behind Brando, and some unspeakable thoughts appeared in his mind, but he did not show it on his face. To him, as long as he got the money, it was fine. Freya watched as the gravekeeper left and went into the fog. She did not know how to clench and unclench her fists several times. The guy looked at her with greedy and filthy eyes, thinking that she did not see it. She almost lost her temper several times, but after all, she was not the little girl who had just left Butchie and was not involved in worldly affairs. She endured it. Brando looked at her and Amandina apologetically, and the sullen feelings in the 2 ladies' hearts naturally disappeared. The 3 of them entered the house. Dienen and Petit Finus consciously guarded outside. In fact, Brando did not need to avoid Petit Finus, but the latter understood that he needed to stay behind to look after the young man. This was also what Brando had told him in advance. Amandina first entered each house and looked around one by one, as if she wanted to find traces of her parents' lives in this old house. However, she was destined to be disappointed. The house was full of coffins and it was filled with a nauseating smell. Amandina went downstairs, upstairs and then back to the living room. Her face was very ugly and she almost vomited. "Is it here?" Brando looked at her face and could not help but ask with concern. Amandina nodded silently. "Can you confirm where it is?" "At the back of the house there is a black pine tree. If I remember correctly, it should be under the tree. There is a small pool there, so it shouldn't be a cemetery. I remember my father once told me about it." Amandina recalled and replied, "He and my mother met at a ball in Baden, and their first date was here." She looked around with some disgust. Of course at that time, this was still a residential area, and you can see the Butchie River not far away. "Then let's hurry up and go to the yard," Freya replied with a frown. "I really don't want to stay here for a moment longer." Damn it, this guy actually turned the place where Amandina's parents used to live into this, a foul atmosphere. Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly when he heard this. This was probably the so-called hatred for the owner affects the object. In his opinion, this house was actually not that big of a deal. Shouldn't a gravekeeper's house be like this? The stench was just the smell of decay and the stench of a corpse. Even though the gravekeeper wasn't someone to be hoped for, being condemned because of this was a bit of a disaster. But he didn't dare to say this in front of the two ladies, because he saw Amandina looking at Freya with obvious gratitude. It seemed that ever since they cried in front of their mother, the relationship between the two of them became better. Just like the traditional structure of the house in the Braggs area, the kitchen led to the back door. Amandina brought them to the backyard, and there was indeed a tall black pine tree behind the house. But the pool in her memory had already dried up. Fortunately, the gravekeeper didn't have the idea of turning his backyard into a cemetery, so the yard was still untouched. But Amandina wasn't sure where her father's inheritance was buried under the black pine tree, so Brando and Freya could only dig a circle around the tree. Fortunately, the gravekeeper's house had a shovel, and the two of them had an endless amount of strength. In the first hour or two they didn't find anything. Amandina's father seemed to have buried the inheritance very deep, or they guessed wrong, the inheritance wasn't here at all, or it had been dug away by someone else. In short, the hole got deeper and deeper, but there was no trace of the inheritance. But when Freya had dug about 2 to 3 meters deep in a certain direction, she suddenly felt her shovel hit something hard. She immediately realized that she might have found something. She quickly stopped and dug up the soil to take a look. Sure enough, she found a rusty iron chest buried under the soil. The box wasn't too big, about the size of a suitcase. Freya quickly called Brando and Amandina, and the three of them worked together to dig the box out from under the soil. After they cleaned up the box, an emblem embossed on the surface of the box was revealed. The emblem was divided into 4 squares, and 2 of the squares had a crescent moon on them. Brando couldn't help but exclaim softly when he saw the emblem. The crescent moon was the symbol of the Erwin family. The emblem of the Cipher family was a crescent moon embedded in a full moon on the shield. The emblem of the House of Covardo was derived from the emblem of the Cipher family. The emblem of the House of Covardo was derived from the emblem of the Cipher family. The emblem of the House of Covardo was derived from the emblem of the Cipher family. Brando couldn't help but look at Amandina. He didn't expect her family to be related to the Cipher family. But his knowledge of heraldry was lacking, otherwise he would probably be able to recognize that she was a descendant of the Cipher family. "My father is a noble from Cipher, my lord?" Amandina had to explain in a low voice. Brando suddenly understood. The nobles of Cipher family were more or less related to the Cipher family. This was not surprising. But this doubt only flashed through his mind and he quickly threw it away. He looked at Amandina. At least for now, the most suitable person to open the box was undoubtedly this noble lady. 2 chapters will be available this weekend. I hope you enjoy reading them, and I'll also ask for monthly votes. Chapter 892. Amandina, you open it? Brando looked at the box and said. Amandina was stunned for a moment before she reacted. She looked at her lord carefully, feeling a little touched, and then nodded gently. She placed her hand on the cold iron box and suppressed the excitement in her heart. She chanted the incantation in a low voice. Word by word came out from her soft lips, low and clear. The lock of the box seemed to be lifted by an invisible hand, and then quietly slid open. Finally it fell to the ground with a bang. She took a deep breath and slowly opened the box. Below was a layer of waterproof tarpaulin, and under the tarpaulin were 3 tightly bundled packages. The wrappers were also made of the same tarpaulin material, and on top of the packages was a letter. The seal on the letter was also printed with the emblem they had seen before. Amandina opened the envelope and carefully read through the contents of the letter. The contents of the letter were similar to the will. If someone else found this inheritance, he hoped that the person who found it would split it into 3 parts. He would be able to inherit the richest part, while the other 2 parts and some miscellaneous items would be left to Amandina and Sadie. At least they would have something to rely on in life, and at the same time, it would also be a memento. There were also some words left for Amandina in the letter, probably hoping that she could be happy and forgive his irresponsible father. After reading the last sentence, Amandina held the letter with both hands for a long time without saying a word. She lowered her head, and her thick eyelashes trembled slightly like feathers. Brando and Freya looked at each other behind her. The future Valkyrie's eyes were full of sympathy, and she almost wanted to share the sorrow in Amandina's heart. She thought of her own background and her heart also softened. After a while, Amandina put down the letter. She looked as if nothing had happened, but her face was frighteningly pale. "My lord, let's open these packages." Seeing her like this, Brando couldn't bear to say anything, so he just nodded. He suddenly wondered if he had really made the right decision to come here. He thought that Amandina had long forgotten the haze of the past, but he didn't expect that these sorrows were buried so deep in her heart. Amandina opened the largest package first, and the gold and silver rays immediately illuminated the three of their faces. There were gold bars and silver ingots neatly stacked together, along with some jewels and deeds to houses and lands. Amandina quickly estimated that there were at least 100,000 tours worth of wealth, which was a large sum of money for a small noble family. However, this money was prepared by her father for the person who discovered the inheritance. Amandina silently put it aside and opened the second package. The second parcel contained similar items, but the amount was only half of the first parcel. This parcel was for her mother. There was also a letter signed by Sadie, her mother. Amandina did not open the envelope. Instead, she stared at the letter for a long while before putting it down gently. Then she picked up the third parcel. This was the smallest parcel, about the size of a dressing box. This parcel was left for her. When she held the parcel, she almost suffocated, but she still held her breath and carefully opened it. She separated the layers of oiled paper, and inside was an exquisite walnut box. When she opened the box again, there was a ring and a thin necklace on top of the velvet cloth. The moment she saw the necklace, she couldn't help but cry. Brando and Freya looked at the necklace in silence. It turned out that the crystal pendant of the necklace was a beautiful recording crystal. When the box was opened, the crystal shone and reflected a man and a woman standing side by side. The man had a head of black hair, and his face vaguely resembled Amandina's. He smiled gently at Amandina. "Anna, if there is a day when you open this box with your own hands, I believe that at this time, I will already be dead. My beloved daughter, I dare not ask for your forgiveness as an irresponsible father, but please believe that your father's life is to pursue the most righteous and just things in this world. Because I know that a person who takes responsibility for this world will never be a sinner. Anna, I hope that there will be a day when you can use your clear eyes to see the truth of this world, and not be blinded by falsehood. Because you are so intelligent, you are my pride. This ring is the token of my engagement with your mother. After obtaining your mother's permission, I will leave it here. I hope that one day it can be a witness to your happiness, to your other half. Anna," the gentle woman who resembled Amandina said with a smile, "I hope that one day, you'll be able to find your own happiness." Liar. Amandina sobbed, as if the emotions that she had been suppressing were finally bursting out like a flood that had broken through a dam. Her beast-like whimpers finally turned into howls of pain. Brando had never seen his quiet and calm Amandina reveal such a side to him. She was as helpless as a child, her weak shoulders trembling, as if she could not make any other sound other than crying. Brando was also choked with sobs. In this world, there were some emotions that could always move people's hearts, and hit the softest part of people's hearts. Family was undoubtedly the kind of emotion that could never be cut off. No matter how strong and indifferent she appeared in his eyes, as if she had already forgotten everything in the past, in front of her parents, she was still crying like a child. She was not biting her lips and tears were welling up in her eyes, but she had completely lost her voice and cried out like a wild beast. Freya also turned her head and wiped the corners of her eyes with her hand. She did not know how much time had passed. Amandina finally sorted out her feelings. She blushed and tried not to look at Freya and Brando, as if she was afraid of being seen by them as a joke. "My lord, I have checked carefully. It seems that there are no relics of Lord Darius here." As soon as she opened her mouth, her face could not help but turn even redder. Because her voice was so hoarse, it was almost like a different person was speaking. Brando looked at her with some concern and asked, "Are you okay, Amandina?" Amandina shook her head and sighed softly. Her heart was in a mess and for a moment she could not tell if she was really okay or not. But in any case, after getting the things that her father left for her, the hatred in her heart for her father who left without saying goodbye seemed to be less intense. She silently thought that perhaps when her mother was holding her hand on the sick bed, she already knew where her father had gone. They had always known because her father had never lied to her mother. They just worked together to deceive her. She smiled, then shook her head gently. Although the tears still hung on her cheeks, Amandina's smile was very cute. Brando finally breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at Freya, and the kind-hearted girl of Bucci also breathed a sigh of relief. There were no relics of Darius in the box, which was completely opposite to what was written in the letter. This was both within and outside of Brando's expectations. He thought for a moment before answering, Amandina, your father could not guarantee that the person who unearthed his inheritance would be you, nor could he guarantee that the person who unearthed it would keep his promise to give the inheritance to you and your mother, so it is unlikely that he would put such an important thing directly in the inheritance. Amandina nodded her head. But he clearly wrote in the letter. Freya asked with some confusion. That was a private letter, there was no need for him to lie, right? She immediately understood and said, I understand there was no need for him to put Lord Darius' relics in his own inheritance, but he could have left clues in the inheritance? Brando looked at her with some surprise. How did you suddenly become so smart? Freya gritted her teeth and glared at him. If my father left a message for me in the inheritance, I think it can only be in my package. Amandina thought for a moment and replied. But isn't it possible that it was in your mother's package? Freya turned back and asked again. Amandina shook her head. My mother's package was basically filled with valuables. My father would definitely take into account the greed of people, and only the inheritance that he left for me was almost all miscellaneous things that wouldn't attract attention. Moreover, I've also checked my mother's package before, and that letter, there was nothing in it that was worth paying attention to. Amandina, you guessed it a long time ago, you're really smart. Freya said with some envy. She was never the smartest one in the Knight Academy, and could even be said to be a little stupid. But for those who were truly talented, she only envied and did not have the slightest bit of jealousy. The princess told her that her father was the most talented knight lord in Erwin's previous era, which made her very distressed. Why was she so clumsy? Amandina smiled slightly. Have you checked it? Brando asked again. Amandina nodded. I've checked the necklace, the ring, and the box inside and out, but I didn't find any clues. She thought for a moment and replied, I don't think my father would leave such important information in a conspicuous place. I'm afraid only by taking them apart will I be able to find out where the clues are. But that's the last thing your father left for you? It's okay, my lord, Amandina replied softly. This is also my father's wish, he won't blame us for this. Besides, if we miss someone, we should keep it in our hearts and not be entangled in these external things. She opened the box, but Brando held her hand. I'll do it. He said, show me the necklace. Amandina was slightly startled. She raised her head and looked at her lord, then nodded and put the necklace in his hand. Brando took the necklace and carefully examined it. Then he pinched the pendant of the necklace and gently turned it. After only a moment, the pendant really did loosen. He dropped the pendant in a certain direction, then carefully held it up to the light in the room, and then pulled out a wrapped piece of paper from it. His actions were without the slightest hesitation, as if he had planned all of this in advance and had already guessed that the note was hidden in the necklace. Freya and Amandina, who were next to him, were completely stunned. My lord? Amandina's mouth was slightly open. She almost thought that her lord was an omniscient and omnipotent god. Recording crystals had a physical characteristic. Their crystal structure was hollow. Brendel had thought of this when he checked the necklace, and he tried to remove the pendant from the necklace. He did not expect to succeed in one try, and he found the key to the pendant. This was also a coincidence. He handed the necklace over to Amandina and explained the reason to her with a wry smile. Amandina finally understood the reason, but she still looked at her lord with great respect. Amandina was a researcher of magicite runes, so she was most familiar with all kinds of crystals. However, the recording crystal was a rare item because it was a man-made magic crystal. There were very few people who truly understood its physical properties. Only her lord, who was so knowledgeable that it was almost unheard of, was able to use it so easily. The three of them opened the note and found that there were some strange symbols drawn on it. It was like a child's scribbles. Brando and Amandina did not understand what it was at first, but Freya said softly, this is a military secret rune. Military secret rune? Brando was slightly surprised. He knew that there were often secret messages that needed to be passed on in the military. Every country had a set of secret symbols that were modified from ancient runes. He was very familiar with Erwin's military secret runes, whether it was the Anson secret runes from 30 years ago or the new secret runes after the Great Frost upheaval. He could decipher them, but the ones in front of him were obviously not any of them. He looked at Freya with a questioning gaze, and the future goddess of war nodded affirmatively at him. This is the military secret rune of the Cruz people, and it's an old secret rune from half a century ago. I just happened to learn it in the Royal Academy. Amandina also realized what she was talking about. Yes, Amandina replied as if she had recalled something. When I was young, my father taught me some of this secret rune, but he did not tell me what it was at that time. Brando did not expect Freya to have learned the secret rune of the Cruz people. He immediately asked, "Can you decipher it?" Freya read it carefully and nodded. "It's not a big problem, Brando, this looks like a map." "What are these?" There were 3 things in front of Freya: a light gray crystal, some reddish-brown stone pieces, and a papyrus map with only a few lines. These 3 things were taken out from the same iron box. This box was taken out from under the floor of an old house in Hood after she deciphered the secret rune. Of course she did not recognize any of them. Brando thought of a way to get Dee in to spend some money to smuggle out the inheritance from her father's tomb. He cast an elemental protection spell on the box so that those people would not be able to open it. There was a lot of work going in and out of the tomb, and the wizards who secretly practiced dark magic would not bring out the corpses one by one, so it was not strange that they used a box. Brando was originally worried that it would arouse suspicion, but he underestimated the extent to which these things were common in the eyes of grave robbers. After the gravekeeper received a sum of money from Dian, he patted his chest and promised that it would not be a problem if he wanted to carry a few coffins out of the tomb, let alone a box. Then he found some nimble people from God knows where. In Brando's eyes, these people's style of doing things was similar to that of the Brotherhood of Thieves. In short, with the help of these people, the box was successfully smuggled out without any hiccups. The people who transported the box had done this kind of work over the years, and the box was moved like a stone in their hands. They did not even look at it from beginning to end. Brando could not help but feel lucky that he was quick-witted enough to cast a windwing spell on the box. Otherwise, with the experience of these people, he was afraid that they would find out that there was a problem with the weight. By the time they transported everything back to the manor and went to Hood to retrieve the last relic of Amandina's father, or rather, the relic of Sword St. Darius, it was almost evening. Brando opened the box in his study and took out the things in the box one by one, and then the scene appeared. But compared to Freya's confusion, Brando and Amandina's expressions were a little different. "My lord, these stone pieces." Amandina remembered sharply, "I seem to have seen them when I was young. When my father first bought them from a merchant, it was as if he had obtained a treasure. After that, he has been buying these stone pieces everywhere. I remember that for quite a long time he has been playing with these stone pieces." "Did he tell you anything?" Brando stared at the gray crystal and asked without turning his head. Amandina recalled for a moment but shook her head. "I was too young at that time. I vaguely remember my father saying a few times that these stone pieces seemed to be the key to something. But later these stone pieces gradually disappeared from my sight. I thought my father had lost interest in them, but I didn't expect him to keep them." "Amandina, have you ever thought that these things are actually related to my grandfather?" Brando replied. "I'm afraid so. According to the letter, this box contains the relics of Lord Darius, as well as the fragments of the picture that father spoke of." "Are you referring to these pieces of stone?" Amandina asked with a hint of doubt. But Brando did not answer. He stared fixedly at the gray gemstone. Chapter 893. Under the light, the gray gemstone appeared dim yet dazzling. This contradictory feeling blended so naturally on this gemstone, as if it would attract people's attention at a glance. Anyone who saw this gemstone for the first time would know that it was not an ordinary gemstone. But this gray gemstone was so familiar to Brando that he opened the dimensional space and took out another gray gemstone that was almost identical to this one. When he slowly opened his palm, Freya let out a soft exclamation. "Brando, the gemstone in your hand is exactly the same as the one your grandfather left behind. Did Lord Darius leave this to you?" Brando glanced at the Erewhon Valkyrie, which gave the latter a shock. Freya had never seen him show such a strange expression and subconsciously thought that she had said something wrong. Brando took a light breath and put the gemstone back. In fact, he still had one more gemstone like this. He had seen similar things twice before. The first time was in the Loop of Trade Winds. The second time was under the glacier in the deadly frost forest. In the Loop of Trade Winds, Archbishop Amon and Wind Empress Saint Tassol called this gemstone the Sealing Stone. And under the glacier, in the strange dream, the Myrna people worshipped it as a sacred object. But he knew in his heart what this thing was, the soul fragment of the Darkness Dragon. This gray gemstone emitted a strange light because it was transparent inside, which meant that the inheritance in the gemstone had been extracted. And this gemstone, it was a relic left behind by his grandfather. Sword St. Darius was the Darkness Dragon? Brando was shocked by this sudden thought. This seemed to explain why Darius was judged by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, exiled, and chose to leave the center of power of the kingdom and live in seclusion. Why did the Allies suddenly change sides during the Holy War? It was because Sword Saint Darius was the Darkness Dragon. Because of this truth, everything seemed to make sense. He shook his head again. But this did not explain why they were attacked by Madara's undead army from behind during the Third Holy War in the game. Besides, if his grandfather was the Darkness Dragon, the Holy Cathedral of Fire wouldn't let him off so easily. After all, the Darkness Dragon was the archenemy of the 4 holy cathedrals. Another suspicious point came from his grandfather's lifespan. In Brando's memories, his grandfather had passed away due to illness, but in fact, it was also due to the gradual aging and decline of his body's functions. His final lifespan could only be considered to be slightly longer among ordinary people, but with Sword Saint Darius's strength and realm, he had passed away at an untimely age. He had long suspected this. Not to mention, after receiving the Dark Dragon's inheritance, his lifespan would be greatly increased. He knew very well what the inheritance of the Dark Dragon meant. It was the blood of God. Brando bent his knuckles and gently knocked on the desk. Doubts arose in his heart as if there was a faint thread in his thoughts, but he couldn't grasp the thread at the moment. At this time, Freya suddenly said, "Brando, Amandine, take a look at this map." Brando already had some guesses and conclusions in his heart at this moment. He raised his head and looked at the simple map, but when he looked at it he was slightly startled. Because on the papyrus map, there were only a few simple lines outlined with a pen that was difficult to fade, and then some crooked annotations were written. The whole map was almost impossible to understand, but he suddenly felt as if he had seen this map somewhere before. Was it in the game? He immediately shook his head. There were very few secret maps in the game. Sophie had come across a few, but most of them were clearer than this one. And in this life he had come across even fewer secret maps. About this map, although he had an impression in his mind, he couldn't remember where he had seen it. Freya looked at him and Amandine, then said, "These annotations are also secret text, and it seems to say a place called Osopol." Osopol? Amandine was stunned. Erwin doesn't have such a place. Cruz doesn't have it either. Brando replied. He took a deep breath. This is the name of the Myrna people. The Myrna people once had a great battle with the Cruz people and the Wind Elves there. All of a sudden he remembered. That feeling was as if another image subconsciously appeared in his mind, and this image naturally overlapped with this simple map, making him suddenly tremble. He suddenly remembered that he had seen this map here before. The Myrna people, Tumen. Tumen had once hidden a map in his mind when he officially embarked on the path of a planeswalker. That map would occasionally appear in his mind, but when he actively tried to recall it, he couldn't remember a single thing. It was because of this that he had a feeling of familiarity and strangeness. At this moment he completely understood. The map that Tumen gave him only had lines of undulating mountains and rivers, but Amandine's father had marked on it. The place that Freya pointed to was the Osopol Plains, which was today's four-leaf clover field. However, there were also some places that Brando thought should be the names of the Myrna people that corresponded to today's names. But the map left behind by Amandine's father was still blank. Although Brando didn't know why Borgnessen would draw such a map, he faintly guessed that the latter was looking for something, and this thing was not only related to the war between the Myrna people and the Black Dwarves 1,000 years ago. It was also related to his grandfather. "Grandfather, who in the world are you?" Brando couldn't help but groan in his heart. He looked at the 3 items on the table, and the doubts in his heart suddenly became more profound than when he didn't find any clues. It was as if he had parted the fog and found that there were even more black clouds behind it, and he couldn't even see his own fingers if he stretched out his hand. His heart was filled with doubts, and he finally couldn't help but open the telepathic link, and said to the Shire and Medisha on the other side, "The Shire, Medisha, are you there? I have a question to ask you." But he didn't expect that as soon as he opened his mouth, the Shire's surprised voice sounded, "Ha, my lord, I have something to ask you and I didn't expect to hear your voice. Our hearts are really connected." "Cut the crap," Brando interrupted him in a huff. "The Shire, let me ask you, do you know the 2 people, Fearmead and Shippard?" The voice on the other side became excited. "My lord, why are you asking about them? That means you know them?" "Of course, they are your grandfather's attendants. Fearmead was born in the Anna family, and is the second son of the Count of Grey Mountain. Shippard was born in a small noble family in Cipher, and he was a famous genius back in the day." The Shire paused and continued, "Brando, did you find them?" Brando shook his head. "I only heard about it by chance." "Did your father tell you?" The Shire sighed. "I have been looking for them." "So you don't know about their situation?" My lord, when they received the princess's order, they left without saying goodbye. I know they must have known something, so I have been looking for them. The Shire replied. Brando frowned and asked sharply, Her Highness. The Shire's voice became hoarse and then he said, Ah, you misheard, my lord. The Shire, I heard from the Night Song Tiger that the scenery in the Gem Plains is very good. I think it is time to give you a holiday. Brando silently threatened. The Shire's voice was almost crying, all right, Brando, please don't put me in confinement, listen to me. All right, that princess. You know, your father almost became the betrothed of one of Princess Griffin's aunts. One of them? I can't reveal her name, I have to protect a lady's reputation. Besides, she may not meet you. The Shire said helplessly. Is what you said true? It's absolutely true, the young attendant mage promised solemnly. Brando frowned, he felt that this guy's words were not completely trustworthy, but if it was true, then the clues were cut off again. He shook his head and suddenly he remembered something. What do you want from me? Don't you have something to ask Medisha? The Shire's forehead was full of cold sweat, and he wanted to change the topic, but he heard Brando's cold snort and he quickly replied, All right, I mean if you don't have something urgent on your side, you should listen to a piece of news from me. What news? Brando was surprised. It was a magic message from a certain countess's subordinate, and she passed it to me. Dilfrey? In front of the princess was a silver brooch, she picked it up and looked at it carefully, then silently put it down. She still remembered the situation that afternoon. The afternoon sun seemed to have a certain taste, and the leaves rustled, but there was no sound except for the silence. She gently tiptoed, then slowly retracted her cold lips. Brando's eyes widened, and he looked at the princess with some confusion. Brando, I'm really grateful to hear that you still want to go down this path, but I still hope that you can seriously consider our engagement. Why? Brando frowned and asked. Erewhon is a small country, and to fight against potential enemies, we must gather the power of the whole kingdom, and even restore the ancient system, Griffin said. Griffin took a few steps back and looked at him carefully with her light silver-gray bright eyes. But this ancient kingdom has been ruled by Cypher and my family for 2 generations. I know it too well. The nobles under my father's rule have different intentions, short-sighted, and only a few have ideals. These people are not worthy of trust. As if to emphasize this sentence, she gently shook her head. The kingdom must re-centralize power, re-establish the local tax system that has been suspended since Anson's time, and weaken the military power of the nobles, but, Brando suddenly understood the hidden meaning behind the but. The Southern Territory already had the foundation to restore the royal power, but the right to decide the future of the whole Southern Territory fell on him. If he supported the princess without reservation, then whether Duke Anthony, Duke Vero or Duke Grenoires objected or not, the final result would not change. The Battle of Autumn Twilight had already shown that Tonajul had such a decisive military power. But if he objected or even just maintained the status quo, then the local nobles would follow his lead and be indifferent. Indeed, the Duke of Vero was the princess's grandfather, and the Duke of Anthony was, at least in name, an ally of the princess. The Highland Knights were detached, but the local nobility and the central royal family were naturally antagonistic. The Duke of Vero would never risk losing his power to support his granddaughter, and the Duke of Anthony was the same. They were happy to see a royal family close to them, but would not allow it to override them. This was a natural conflict between the princess's ideals and the Duke's core interests. But what should he do? The kingdom must re-centralize power, and Tonajul and Valhalla naturally could not be detached. It could even be said that they were the first to bear the brunt of this. Her Highness wants me to set an example, but can I trust this half-elf girl? Trendheim and Valhalla were built by me step by step. It's where many people's hopes and future lie. The Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries who experienced the November War, the adventurers who were persecuted by Grodin, the residents of the Green Village and even Amandina and Karglais. Their hopes and dreams are all wrapped around me. This is the responsibility that comes with authority. Can I pass this responsibility to others? He silently weighed everything in his heart. From an emotional point of view, he was willing to trust the princess. She was able to persist in her ideals, and had a heart that pursued benevolence and justice. She was the eldest princess of Erewhon, and the holy princess who had won the hearts of countless players in history. But no one was perfect. Whether she would still be controlled by her aristocratic nature in this life, hesitating and compromising with the conservative forces, was related to the fate of many people. Reason told Brando that the princess had a weak side in her nature, and she was not a true reformer. And all of this depended on the gentleness in her nature. History had already judged everything, and today's outcome depended on his choice. Brando was very clear that he was different from the princess. He had no foundation in this world, and the only thing he cared about was his parents. But Princess Griffine had an unbreakable connection with the old nobles, and she was not the ruthless Silver Queen. Brando looked at the princess in front of him. She was half a head shorter than him, and she raised her head slightly. Her pale silver-gray eyes did not avoid his gaze. She pursed her lips, and her silver curly hair fell down, shining beautifully under the sunlight. Her pointy ears peeked out from under her long hair, showing that she was an elf. No one would doubt the beauty of this princess. She had the nobility of a royal family mixed with the natural intimacy of a forest breeze. Of course, Brando would not forget that his lips still had the fragrance of a young girl. "I know what you are thinking, Brando." Princess Griffine saw that he understood and said, "But if the person who can decide the future of a kingdom is too naive, it may not be a good sign for you and for me." Brando heard the hidden meaning in her words, so he asked, "Then what do you think I should do, Your Highness?" Princess Griffine looked at Brando. He could actually take the same path as Erek, dethroning her and Haruz and establish himself as king. His strength was actually better, and he had more ability and time to do so. However, if he did so, he would lose the reputation that accompanied him in his rightful position. If all he needed was a throne and supreme power, he could have chosen this path. But if he chose the latter path, he would lose far more than he would gain. Princess Griffine's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at the different noble, the count, and quietly replied, "Marry me. I am Haruz's sister. In fact, it's not that I don't have the right to inherit the throne, and you as my husband, can legitimately manage and rule this country according to the traditions of the kingdom. At that time, Tonajal and Valhalla will be the territory of the royal family. Viro, Lantanailan, and even Grimoires and Karsuk will submit to you, which is also a legitimate matter." She paused. "However, if one day you no longer have any interest in the throne, only Haruz or his descendants can inherit this position." Wasn't this Erek, but the conditions were much harsher. Brando listened to Princess Griffine's words and couldn't help but smile bitterly. "Your Highness, but it doesn't sound like I'm marrying you, it sounds like I'm marrying you." Princess Griffine smiled somewhat mockingly. She could see that Brando didn't care about the power in his hands. "But I already have a fiancé," Brando could only reply. "Let's put this matter aside first." "It's okay, then I'll wait for your answer." Princess Griffine was not annoyed at all, but smiled slightly. Brendel had no choice but to flee. Griffine's fingers pressed on the brooch as if she had recovered from her memories. She looked up at the sunset outside the window. The sunset was as red as fire, hanging far below the golden clouds. At this time there was a knock on the door. She was slightly startled, listened to the sound and said, "Please come in, Mrs. Hill." After the door opened, it was her maid who appeared outside. The woman in her 40s held a letter in her hand and stood outside the door respectfully. "Your Highness. It's so late, what's the matter?" Princess Griffine looked at her and asked. "There's a letter from Valendenburg," Mrs. Hill replied. "Is it for me?" "Yes, it's a letter from Mr. Oberway." Griffine took the letter, opened the envelope, then unfolded the letter inside and read it carefully. She raised her eyebrows slightly at first, then her face changed color. "Your Highness, the Silver Empress of the Cruz Empire has recently made an exception to confer the title of Countess to a female. According to reliable information, this new Countess is from Erewhon and has some kind of close relationship with Count Tonajal." Chapter 894. Cruz's Envoy? A man named Donis Burney, a viscount. "Wait, I know this man," Brando interrupted the Shire, remembering that Veronica had once told him this name. This man was a secret envoy of the Silver Queen. After the explosion in the deadly Frost Forest, the Empire sent an envoy to investigate the whereabouts of the eldest prince. This man was the main person in charge of the envoy. Veronica also told him that this man's real purpose was probably to confirm the death of the eldest prince. "I also know about this envoy," he finally remembered this matter. Recently, there had been a succession of affairs, mainly the Autumn Twilight War and the sudden letter from Her Royal Highness, which made him almost forget about this matter. Are these Cruz people ready to return to the Empire? Why did Dilfrey suddenly tell us this? "No, my lord, in fact, the Cruz envoy is still in Lantanailan. Now they are in charge of someone else. According to our understanding, this Mr. Donis Burney has not appeared from beginning to end," the Shire replied. "What the hell is going on?" Brando frowned. "It is said that because the Viscount suddenly felt unwell, he returned with the fleet in Dirtle. He did not go ashore in a wreck at all. Brando thought that this was obviously an excuse. Since this man was the Queen's secret envoy, how could he return empty-handed because he was unwell? He first thought that maybe the cruise people noticed something, but then he suddenly realized how Dilfrey knew about this. In the territory, there were only a few people around him who knew about the existence of the Broken Sword Knight Order and Prince Leneret. He suppressed the doubts in his heart and asked, "This is just an internal matter of the cruise people. Why did Miss Dilfrey tell us this?" The Shire naturally understood Brando's subtext. He replied, "My lord, this is actually the case. It is said that the cruise people's returning fleet hunted a rare beast on the shining sea and wanted to present it to Her Majesty the Queen. In order to guard against the attack of the Temple of the Earth, they chose a more reliable land route. Count Yenbao's situation is unknown. Some people say that he is seriously ill, some say that he is dead. In short, he has not appeared in public since 4 or 5 months. As for Miss Dilfrey, Miss Dilfrey is now Tanajul, guest." When he said the word guest, there was inevitably some awkwardness. In fact, everyone knew that the Countess was worried about her father's situation and was eager to fly back to the Yenbao territory immediately. However, she was placed under house arrest in Abes by Brando. Of course, this was also at the behest of Her Royal Highness the Princess. The purpose was to ensure the safety of the Countess so that she would not be a moth to a flame. He paused for a moment and continued, "All in all, now Yenbao is a dragon without a head. Those guys led by Baron Dahl spread all kinds of rumors all day long, wanting to seize the Count's power. However, the Yenbao family's reputation is still there, and it will be difficult for them to succeed in a short time. The cruise empire has also had considerable influence in Yenbao for a long time, so of course, these people will not let go of the opportunity to curry favor with Viscount Donas Burney. I don't know if you still remember that you and Her Royal Highness had asked Count Yanalasu to investigate Yenbao. Soon after that, the Count sent a group of people into Yenbao. These people were quite efficient. They quickly got in touch with Dilfrey's old subordinates and established a secret network. Brando knew that this matter was actually ordered by Her Royal Highness, and he did not intervene at all. However, when it came to the Shire's mouth, he, the feudal lord, got half of the credit for no reason. Of course, he could hear this kind of compliment, but it was difficult to expose it. Or rather, it was better to say that he had long been used to it. But when he heard this, he finally understood something. The Shire continued, "So these people reported this matter to Count Yanalasu as usual. They also used a record crystal to attach the images of the convoy, Mr. Donas Burney, and other accompanying servants and assistants. Count Yanalasu then sent the report and the record crystal to Miss Dilfrey. This matter itself is not too important, but Miss Dilfrey more or less heard about you, Lady Veronica, and Prince Leneret entering the deadly frost forest together. After she learned about the purpose of this diplomatic mission, she was worried that the Kurlutzians would harm you, my lord, so she handed these things over to Medisa. I didn't expect that our little princess would really find out something What's fishy?" Brando frowned slightly when he heard this. "This Viscount Donas Burney, there's nothing wrong with him, but Princess Medisha seems to have recognized someone among the entourage and assistants of the convoy." Recognize someone? Brando's heart skipped a beat. This person should be one of the military officers accompanying Cruz and Veronica. I have some impression of him, but it's not as deep as Medisha's. "My lord," Medisha's voice finally sounded at this time. It was as gentle as ever, but it was organized. "If I remember correctly, that person should be called Boy Mare. I've heard others call him that before. He went under the glacier with us at that time. He's one of the noble military officers accompanying Cruz. He's a little young, about 20 years old." Brando felt as if there was an electric current flowing through his back, making his hair stand on end. He took a light breath. Although he did not speak, his expression was so serious that Amandina and Freya could see the clues. The two girls looked at each other and looked at him with some worry. Brando put his hands on the desk. Countless images flashed through his mind. He thought carefully for a moment and suddenly asked, "When did Cruz's envoy arrive in Dirtle?" "The 19th of August. That's the fire-raising festival of the mountain people." Amandina answered without thinking. "The 19th of August." Brando repeated to himself. "It's been 4 weeks since we left the deadly tundra. It's been exactly a month." "The Shire, how long has it been since Viscount Donas Burney arrived in Yenbao?" he asked again. The Shire calculated. "Miss Dilfrey received the letter last week, but it took a lot of twists and turns to reach Tanajul. It should have been at least a month before that, not less." A month? Brando's heart went cold. This was enough time for Cruz to walk back to Lust Tower. Freya looked at him from the side and finally couldn't help but ask. Brando, what happened? I think we were careless, Freya. Brando answered word by word. Careless? It's all my fault. I didn't think of this direction at all. He could not help but pat his forehead in annoyance. Then he said in a deep voice, Seal, let the spies we sent out ask. Let them search the area around the deadly frost forest again. Spread out the image of that guy and confirm if anyone has seen him. No, I think someone has definitely seen him. The key is where and when. I want to find out the answer to this question as soon as possible. Also, think of a way to send a group of people to the Cruz Empire. If it doesn't work, ask Count Janalesu to help us. He won't refuse. My lord, before I pass this message to you, Miss Roman had already sent people. Now the territory is fully activated, the Shire replied. But there are some mercenary leaders who still don't understand the situation. They want to ask if you are making a fuss over nothing. Medisha and I are also here to ask you for instructions. She did the right thing. Brando heard the news and let out a long sigh. Wait for the news. I hope Cruz won't regret it. Brando felt someone pressing down on his arm. He turned around and saw Amandina looking at him with some worry. Is there news about Scarlet? Amandina asked sharply. He nodded slowly. The victory of the Battle of Autumn Dusk had not yet spread throughout the south, but all kinds of rumors had already spread widely in the areas affected by the war. The Ranner people were uneasy for the first 2 weeks, but they were also looking forward to it. They were uneasy because they were afraid of being punished, but they were also looking forward to it because the young and promising Count was likely to become their new ruler in the future. But compared to the other parts of the south where all kinds of rumors were flying, Vero and Tanajul were uncharacteristically quiet. In Vero, Fort Valentine was sending out a large number of messengers day after day. They carried the secret letter back and forth between the north and south, day after day. In Tanajul, only a few people with sharp senses could sense that a storm was brewing under the calm surface. The merchants in Port Gris gradually began to feel that the patrols of the cavalry were becoming more frequent, and the inspections were becoming stricter day after day. The goods exported from the territory were also quietly changing. The magic crystals in the Black Forest had been decreasing for several months, and it seemed that they had finally run out. Furs, leather, and metal ores were replaced by other goods, and the number of ships transporting goods into the territory had suddenly increased. Some people were secretly speculating that the people of Tanajul were preparing for a new war. The weather was getting colder by the day, but the black pines in the forest seemed to be growing taller in the cold weather. Or perhaps it was the withered leaves that set off these evergreen Arowan symbols. Even though the rivers had not started to freeze, most of them were already covered in white frost. At the beginning of November, it was said that people in Menta saw knights descending from the sky and walking out of the flames. These knights were like gods descending from the heavens, patrolling the skies for a while before disappearing. Those who witnessed this scene with their own eyes swore that they were the maids of war. It was said that when they appeared, it often meant the arrival of an era of war. While these illusory legends were spreading, a message tied to the leg of a carrier pigeon fell into the hands of the Shire. There's news, my lord. When the Shire spoke through the telepathic link, Brando was still telling his mother the stories that had happened in the past few days. The fireplace was already lit, and the charcoal crackled inside the iron fence. He had already repeated his experiences more than 10 times, but Lady Windsor did not get tired of it at all, especially when she knew that her son had a kind-hearted and good housekeeper in Tanajul. This was how Brando described it. He thought that the Roman's mind was simple, and could probably be described as kind-hearted. As for housekeeping, the merchant girl had the ability to gain something without risking anything, so it should be barely acceptable. But when he heard the Shire's words, he immediately stood up from the sofa and gestured to his mother, Amandina, and Freya. He then walked to the side and asked in a low voice, "What's going on?" "My lord, you guessed right. Someone has seen this person near the deadly frost forest. That person is a farmer near Bernisel called Old Bayard. He has a daughter called Jocelyn, and they rented a carriage to that person after the explosion. It is said that the person gave them a sum of money and never appeared again. There was another person with him, and according to the girl's description, Medisha believes that the second person should be a noble called Babarn. They rented a carriage." Brando muttered to himself, "Bernisel has a hostel, so why would they rent a carriage from a farmer's house? Most of the farmers' carriages are covered wagons with large sheds. Normal nobles would not ride those things. They wanted to store something," the Shire replied. "And then?" Brando asked again, Did anyone see this carriage near Dirtle? No, if I were them I would be more careful. They should have changed carriages along the way. My lord, you guessed correctly. They changed carriages at Arucher and Winterrose Castle. But after we confirmed their route, it was easy to ask for these details. The last carriage they used was indeed last seen in Dirtle. Someone saw them around the middle of August. Middle of August. Brando replied, Dirtle cruise? He took a deep breath and clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked. He practically squeezed out the last few words from between his teeth. Mr. Donna's Bernie and the others, the rare beast they were escorting was probably transported by a carriage, right? Yes, my lord. The Shire was silent for a while before he replied, My lord. Amandina and Freya sat on the sofa and looked at Brando's gloomy face. The fireplace in the study room was also burning with flames, illuminating a few faces. Go and invite the Count, Mistress Hill. I'll have to trouble you. Princess Griffin put down the letter in her hand and looked at Makarov. This was the 10th letter she received in 2 weeks. This letter was personally sent by the cunning fox of the kingdom. It was obvious that the royal faction had foreseen the subtle changes in the situation. It was not strange for the Empire to confer the title of Countess. It could even be said that it had nothing to do with Erwin. But the Countess' birth was related to a similarly sensitive person in the kingdom. After reading the letter, Griffin let go of the last bit of hope in her heart and gently threw the letter on the table. She was exhausted as she spoke to her maidservant. The noblewoman opened the door and walked out. She could not help but look back at the withered leaves outside the window and sighed slightly. Your Highness. Makarov reminded her softly. You don't have to say anything, Lord Makarov. I understand. Griffin looked at him and replied. In just a moment, Brando came into her study room. His expression was still a little stiff as if he had not recovered from the news he received earlier. He bowed to Princess Griffin and raised his head. Naturally, he saw Princess Griffin sitting behind the desk and Makarov standing beside her. Brando looked at the cunning fox of the kingdom and then turned his gaze to Griffin. Neither of them spoke, but they seemed to understand each other's thoughts. The princess lowered her head and looked at the letter on the table. She said softly, Mr. Brando, I have to tell you about this. It's about the Azure Lance, isn't it? Brando opened his mouth. Griffin looked up at him. Her pale silver-gray eyes were full of complicated emotions, but she finally told him about Scarlet in detail. The Silver Queen had already made her a Countess of the Empire. In the past 2 weeks, all the news from various sources had been confirmed, including the origin of this mountain girl and her relationship with the Count of Tonagel. After she finished, she asked softly, Brando, what do you plan to do? Your Highness, guess what I would do if this question was asked by someone from Cruz. Brando was silent for a moment. Then he replied with a somewhat cold tone. Griffin's hand that was flat on her skirt tightened. Of course, she could hear the hidden anger in Brando's calm voice. But she looked straight into his eyes, her eyes flashing with the light of thinking, but she did not answer. Instead, it was Makarov who spoke. My lord, they are from Cruz. I know. My lord, Her Highness is telling you this out of respect. But I have to ask you a question. Have you thought about the relationship between Tonagel and the kingdom, and between Tonagel and the Empire? So? Brando asked. Don't put the kingdom in danger because of a moment of anger. The Azure Lance is important to the kingdom, but it's not important enough to let innocent people bleed and die for it. Makarov sighed and advised patiently. Brando looked at this person, an important member of the royal faction. He shook his head as if he heard a joke and replied, Mr. Makarov, you are mistaken about one thing. I don't care about the Azure Lance at all. The only mistake the Empire made today was to not go against the will of a person and take her away from this land. Of course, you may not care who this person is, but I have to tell you one thing. His voice wasn't loud, but it seemed to be filled with an invisible magic that silenced the room. Griffin and Lady Hill beside her had never seen a noble who could speak so boldly to his peers. Griffin's eyes flashed slightly, while the lady was almost stunned. Makarov's expression was very ugly. He suddenly realized that this wasn't the first time Brando reprimanded him like this. Brando didn't care about his thoughts and replied softly, If the Empire thinks that by forcing a war the nobles of the Erwin Kingdom will consider the bigger picture and retreat, then I have only one thing to say to them. I, Brando, Lord of Abes, Count of the Tonagel Kingdom, have not developed the habit of condoning such logic. He said to Makarov, I promise that the people of the Erwin Kingdom will not shed blood for meaningless reasons, but the kingdom protects its people. This is the most glorious thing in the world. If the people of the Erewhon Kingdom can shed blood for another person of the Erewhon Kingdom today, then more people will shed blood for them tomorrow. Mr. Makarov, this is the pride and backbone of a people. If anyone thinks that they are weak and can be bullied, then they are gravely mistaken. Brando finished and bowed to Griffin like a knight bidding farewell to his king. He turned around and opened the door. Before he left, he said, "Your Highness, I once promised a little girl that I will protect each and every one of them. I will keep my promise, whether the enemy is Cruz or Madara or even the whole world. I will not go back on my words. Your Highness, if this is what the people of the Cruz Kingdom want, then I will answer them with these two words. War. Kacha *. The door closed in front of the three people in the room. Makarov's expression changed. He wanted to say something but he didn't know what to say. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly and bid farewell to the princess. The two of them left the study one after the other. After a long while, Mrs. Hill seemed to have recovered from the previous shock. She couldn't help but pat her chest and said with some trepidation, "This is outrageous. This count is really bold. He really dares to go to war with the Kurlutz people?" Griffin turned around and looked at her maid in a daze. "Did you know Lady Hill?" she said in a daze. "My father's nobles also faced the same question. Do you know what they said to me?" She took a deep breath, and her eyes seemed to have returned to that stormy night in Ampere Seal. P.S. It took a bit of time to think about the new plot, so it was a bit late. To make it up to everyone, I added 6,000 words. Chapter 895. Under the towering curved dome, the undulating sacred sound finally came to an end. 12 high-ranking priests wearing gold-trimmed red robes were deathly pale, almost unable to stand steadily. The attendants and low-ranking servants at the side hurriedly stepped forward to support them. These high-ranking figures were either the regional archbishop of Rusta or the senior scholars of the academy. Their statuses were grand and respected, and could be said to be second only to the figures above the dome of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Their strength matched their statuses. Among them, Archbishop Christopher of the Cohen region, Blessed Andres, and Master Sutton of the Academy had already entered the path of truth and were only a step away from the sanctum of fire. The residents of Rusta were used to calling the 11 people above the dome of the Holy Cathedral of Fire the sanctum of fire. Over time this saying had spread. In addition to these 3 people, the other 9 people had also activated their elemental energy. Normally, people of their status would rarely personally preside over the sacraments or ceremonies. But when they did, most of them were at their fingertips and would never be in such a sorry state as they were now. It's really breathtaking. The person who looked at this scene was Vala. It was hard to imagine that the person in charge of the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire was such a kind-looking little old man. His beard and eyebrows were already snow-white, and his body had shrunk a lot. He wore a red bishop's cape with snow-white fur edges. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he trembled as if a gust of wind could blow him away. But only a pair of deep drooping eyelids, with a flash of light in his eyes and the clear lines of his tightly pursed lips, could prove that this old man who had controlled the Holy Cathedral for more than half a century was not as simple as he appeared to be. The world called him the Great Priest of Fire and Iron. He was the only one of the 11 Sanctum of Fire who had experienced a complete holy war. There was a popular saying about him in Rusta: "The Sanctum of Fire is never merciful." This saying described his character, and he was definitely not as kind as he looked. He stood on the altar with 2 others, and the person he was speaking to was a woman on the left behind him. She was tall, wearing a short white shawl, a tall crown on her head, and a scepter with a golden flame emblem in her hand. Her long shawl dragged on the smooth obsidian floor. Her face was a little too thin, and her cheeks seemed to have been cut by a knife or an axe, so much so that her feminine beauty could not be seen, and she appeared too cold. She had short platinum hair, tied in a long thin braid at the back of her head, hanging over her shawl. This woman was Sidney Metferica, the 3rd in command of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the 4th master of the Kurlutz Empire. The legends about her were innumerable since the Year of the Stars. It was said that she had fought with the 4th leader of the Bugaz wizards and lost by a hair, but it was a glorious defeat. Ordinary people often described a person's gaze as sharp as an eagle's, but such words seemed weak in front of this lady. Her gaze was not only sharp, but it also seemed to have substance. With just a glance, people could understand what she meant. There was a circle of golden flame in the depths of her pupils, which was related to the divine power she wielded, the angel of the holy sword, Iroma. In terms of mastery of the holy words, no one in the empire could surpass her. Even Vala had to admit this. The other person next to Vala was extremely ornate in his silk robe. He had a kind face and looked more like a businessman. This person was called Caesar, and he was ranked at the bottom of the 11. His name sounded very domineering, but he was diligent in history but did not achieve much. Sydney maintained her usual silence. Even when the master of the Holy Cathedral of Fire spoke in front of her, she had no intention of responding. It was not unreasonable for people to call her the adoratress of the Leo Palace, but Vala admired her character. Compared to the era of the previous generation of the Great Priest because of the Holy War, this generation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was generally younger. Young people always seemed to be too radical but not calm enough except for Sydney. His Majesty issued an edict on the 14th, and these people entered the city on the 17th. The people of the scholastics were the most responsive. Great Priest, Caesar reminded in a low voice. Vala nodded. He certainly understood the hidden meaning of this sentence. For centuries, Cruz's imperial power had finally developed to its peak in the past 100 years. Sometimes he could not help but think how good it would be if he was born in the era before his teacher. At that time, the Holy Cathedral could not only develop its power freely in small countries like Erewhon and Antiburo, but also intervene in secular affairs. In the era when the religious power was at its peak, even the right of succession to the throne was in the hands of the Great Priest. But now, the old man could only feel bitterness in his mouth. After this, I'm afraid that His Majesty's influence within the Holy Cathedral will rise again. Great Priest. I understand. Vala shook his head. The scholastics had always been closer to the royal family. They had been wanting to carry out doctrinal reforms since the Year of Thunder, and had long begun to criticize the Great Priest. Although a group of people had been purged after the Holy War, this obviously could not stop those lunatics. The Holy Cathedral was indeed going to undergo changes, and he was more and more aware of this point. But the authority to preside over the changes must not fall into the hands of those who formed cliques for personal gain. Otherwise, there would be no tomorrow for the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He knew that Caesar's words were reminding him that he should not satisfy Her Majesty's request this time. Although the imperial power was increasingly infiltrating the Holy Cathedral of Fire still had the right to decide its own internal affairs. His decision allowed the Supreme, who seemed to never age, to reach into the interior of the Holy Cathedral, which had long caused dissatisfaction among many of the 11 people. Today only he, Sydney, and Caesar were present, which showed that Sydney was not interested in fighting for power, Caesar was submissive, and the others were obviously very dissatisfied. But that's the Azure Lance. Vala let out a long sigh. Their empress was too difficult to deal with. Sometimes he wondered whether it was Cruz's fortune to have such an empress, or the misfortune of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Azure Lance was a sacred object of the mortal world, an object brought to the Second Era by the Azure Knight who shattered the sky. In the Pale poem, it was described as the hope of mortals, the holy lance that changed fate. It could be imagined that if any holy cathedral had such an artifact and gained its recognition, it would greatly increase the prestige of the Holy Cathedral. Whether it was for public or private reasons he could not refuse. Caesar also closed his mouth. Of course he understood the meaning of this. He could not help but look back at his colleagues. Even Sydney, who usually had the same expression on his face, had a glint in his eyes at this moment. After all, it was the Holy Lance of Heaven. What a pity, why did the person who held the lance have to be a mountain person? Caesar thought regretfully. If he did not already know that the Holy Lance was transported out of Erewhon and had an owner before that, he would have thought that this was the plan of the Supreme Empress. Because as everyone knew, among the countries under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, only the mountain people did not believe in the teachings of Gretel. They worshipped their ancestors and the spirit of nature, so they were called the barbarians. But it was such barbarians who were recognized by the Holy Lance. Your Majesty, giving the object that changes fate to a foreign race just to suppress the Holy Cathedral, you are playing with fire? How can mortals control the future in their hands? The gods are bound to sin. Vala was also helpless and could not help but mutter to himself. The three of them did not speak and silently watched the crystal in the center of the hall thin layer by layer, and finally disappear into nothingness. The girl inside closed her eyes, and with the lance in her hand, broke out of the ice, as if she had lost her center of gravity. She weakly knelt on the ground, then fell down, and just like that, fainted on the floor that was filled with layers of formations. Vala looked at the pieces of crystal that fell to the ground, and vaguely saw the Holy Cathedral falling apart. The scholastic faction was no longer on their side, and the local officiants were also indecisive. William's failure was a heavy blow to the Holy Cathedral's prestige outside the empire. He thought of that good-for-nothing guy and could not help but feel angry. A dignified knight commander of the Holy Cathedral was defeated by a junior. It was simply humiliating. Unfortunately, it was not only his face that was lost or the Cecil family's face, but also the Holy Cathedral's face at the same time. He then thought of Erwin, the little Count of Tonagel, the rumored grandson of the sword Saint Darius, and could not help but mutter, "Why is it this guy again? He's really haunting me." Caesar heard this whisper from the side and could not help but shiver, and his face changed. Of course, he still remembered the upheaval 40 years ago, the decline of the Holy Cathedral, as if it was the beginning of that unfair trial. He looked at the high priest beside him, and suddenly thought that the high priest agreed to Her Majesty's conditions so readily. It was probably not just because of the azure lance. He suddenly remembered that as early as last week at the royal banquet, Her Majesty seemed to have vaguely revealed the origin of the new countess, and her relationship with Erwin, the Count of Tonagel. Thinking of this, he could not help but break out in a cold sweat, and hurriedly tightened his face, as if he was afraid that the Supreme One beside him would see his thoughts. But Vala did not care about him at all, and instead turned to Sidney and said, "Sidney, take the Countess to bathe and freshen up, and be good to her." The high priest was stunned and then nodded indifferently. The girl was dressed like a princess. She was wrapped in a Baroque light yellow dress. Her fiery red hair was draped over her shoulders like flowing flames. Her slender neck and delicate collarbone were exposed in the air. A thin mithril necklace was threaded through a flaming diamond. The amber color of the necklace reflected the healthy luster of her skin. The fluffy skirt was full of rose-like folds, the multiple layers of sleeves, the gauze lining, and the huge bow on the chest almost dressed her up like a delicate doll, and the tight girdle that hugged her waist almost broke her waist, making her breathless. Scarlet looked at all this, somewhat at a loss, her amber eyes full of uneasiness. The experience of this day was like an absurd dream to her. She dreamed that she was sleeping in a huge piece of amber, during which she experienced many things and saw strange scenery, but most of the time she was covered with a black cloth, or locked in a box, never to see the light of day. Occasionally, when she felt uneasy, there would be a voice to chat with her, but the frequency was not particularly high. The young lady of the azure lance was so proud that she could not wait to draw a conclusion in 2 sentences to prove that she was a fool. Then she saw herself being transported into a magnificent temple, where many priests were performing a ritual around her, and her ears were filled with the low humming of hymns. Then she felt as if she had woken up, and in a hazy state, there was a lady in a white robe leading her, and then the lady asked a few maids to help her bathe and change her clothes. Scarlet had never experienced such a scene in her life, and she was almost scared stiff. She tried to escape several times, but she was stopped by the lady every time. The strength she was proud of was as weak as a child in front of the other party, unable to withstand a single blow. She remembered that every time the other party stared at her and casually recited a prayer, and then it was as if an irresistible pressure descended from the sky, penetrating the dome of the temple, and directly exerting itself on her, immobilizing her. At this moment she was sitting on a bench, which was so luxurious that it almost looked like a carved wooden throne. Even in the liege's castle she had never seen such a beautiful chair. She stared at herself in a long mirror in front of her, although the beautiful figure in the mirror did not look like her at all. A few maids surrounded her, carefully grooming her, and Scarlet knew that she could not resist, so she just let them manipulate her like a puppet. The maids looked at their new mistress and compared her to the beauty in the mirror. They carefully combed her long hair, put on sparkling earrings and whispered to each other. Occasionally they would let out a low chuckle which made Scarlet's face burn. She still couldn't figure out where she was, why she was here, and why she was dressed in such strange clothes. She wanted to contact Ovina, but the young lady of the azure lance seemed to have other matters to attend to today. Scarlet's question sank like a stone in the ocean. Fortunately, she could still feel the presence of the azure lance, which made her feel a little more at ease. The maids around her were all delicate and cute, obviously carefully selected. However, most of them had long or short crimson hair of different shades, which made it clear that they were from the azure lance. Scarlet looked at these people she had never met before, and listened to them whispering softly in her ear. For a moment she did not want to lose her temper, so she could only be patient. Of course, this was also because she knew that the overly strict priestess was still waiting outside. "My lady," a round-faced maid said enviously, "you really are our princess, the most beautiful girl among the mountain people." "What did you call me?" Scarlet was not very good at dealing with strangers, but when she heard this she could not help but be surprised. She asked the question almost in a daze. "Oh yes, my lady, you still don't know, right?" You are the only count in the past few hundred years who was personally appointed by His Majesty. Your fief is said to be the most fertile land in the kingdom at the edge of the wilderness of the four territories. Yes, yes, yes. I've seen the maple forest there before. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. I can see that His Majesty admires you very much. The maids chattered. Most importantly, it's close to the land of our mountain people, the mountains of Valisai. I really want to go home and take a look even in my dreams. Scarlet was confused. She looked at the maids in confusion, not understanding what they were talking about. She was born in Chablis and there were many mountain people there as well. When she was young, she did hear legends about the mountain people's homeland, the mountains of the Latch of Wa. But those were all distant dreams. She listened to the maids talk about fief, His Majesty, and the Count. Her mind was in a mess and she could not think of anything for a while. But she could see that these girls sincerely worshipped her. They chattered to her, "My Countess, I heard that His Majesty intends to give you the autonomy of that land after you swear allegiance to him with your sword. That land in your hands is equivalent to returning to the hands of us mountain people. The independence and autonomy that we have dreamed of for thousands of years can finally be realized in your hands, my Countess." The maids discussed enthusiastically, but as they spoke, their voices became softer and softer. The mountain people's situation in the empire was not much better than in Erewhon. In fact, it was even worse. The Cruz people saw them as barbarians, and the nobles captured them as if they were wild beasts. Once the mountain men and women were chased out of the forest, they would be locked up in cages like wild beasts. They would leave their homes and be sold to other places. Those who were better off could become servants of the nobles, but most of them died in some unknown mine. Who would be willing to leave their homeland? However, the history of the resistance of the mountain people had become a legend centuries ago. Within the borders of the empire, other than a small number of clans that relied on the empire, most of them hid in the mountains and lived like wild beasts. But even the remaining ones were inferior to the nobles. They could be captured at any time for various reasons and become slaves. These seemed to be the common experiences of these girls. The room suddenly fell silent for a moment, and several of the girls could not help but sob. The round-faced maid choked and said, "My lord, do you know today because of you we, the mountain people, no longer have to leave our homes and families, and no longer have to be hunted down by those Kurlutz people like wild beasts. My lord, your name will spread throughout the mountains of the empire, and one day you will be the hero of the mountain people." Scarlet opened her mouth. She felt that she must be dreaming. She could not help but grab the handrail as if she wanted to stand up unsteadily. She was not used to the crystal shoes on her feet. She walked like a puppet. The maids at the side hurriedly supported the princess to prevent her from stepping on their skirts and falling to the ground. This was not something that had not happened before. But Scarlet looked around and finally asked, "I don't quite understand what you are talking about. My lord, where is he?" "My lord, aren't you?" Scarlet shook her head hard and was about to refute when someone knocked on the door. Then Sydney's voice came in. "Count Mitra, if you are done dressing up, someone wants to see you." The maidservants quieted down as if they had suddenly turned into puppets. They knew who would come here at this time. Chapter 896. The autumn wind in the area south of the Anfer Mountains, which was called Ankara by the locals, was blowing gently across the vast white plains. Waves of varying depths swept across the vast sea, and the undulating hills seemed to be the waves on the sea. A young lion man riding a golden lion was standing on the peak of the waves, overlooking the shining horizon in the north of the plains. The lion he was riding was clad in magnificent armor, with beautiful ornaments hanging from its mane. It stood in the white withered grass, shaking its huge head from time to time and sneezing slightly. The White Plains were the symbol of Toquinin and the origin of the name of the White Plains. The plains stretched from the Silver Sand Coast to the west, to the border of the human kingdoms in the east. In the north, under the endless mountains, lay the powerful empire called Cruz. The young lion man stared in that direction. "Nair, we should go back. That's the limit of today's patrol area. If you go any further, I won't be able to bear the responsibility." Behind the hill, another lion man stood beside his mount and shouted to the young man on top of the hill. The young lion man replied without turning his head, "It's okay. We'll cross that place tomorrow." Its emerald-like eyes flashed with a certain light. Even by human standards, it could be considered a rather handsome lion man. Its golden mane was like a tassel, and its body was well proportioned. Although it was stronger than most humans, the lines of its muscles were very smooth. Its upper body was bare, and only its right shoulder and arm were covered in heavy armor. On its chest was a necklace made of beast teeth. The young lion man below could not see the scenery behind the mound, but he knew that there used to be a magnificent fortress there, built with pure white stones transported from the plains. Now, only the scattered debris in the grassland proved that it had once existed. "Nair, the humans will pay for this," he said. "Yes, Amon," the young lion man replied. With the help of her maids, Scarlet spent a lot of effort to walk through the long corridor and finally saw the person that Sydney spoke of in a courtyard filled with birds and flowers. Unlike what she had imagined, the person in front of her was not a cold and stern noble, nor was it a graceful and luxurious lady. Instead, it was a young girl who was a little younger than herself. Aside from the coldness on her face that did not match her age, her body and face were similar to a human girl of 14 or 15 years old. Her blonde hair reached her waist, and her face was as delicate as a doll's. She wore an extremely masculine silk robe with a circle of ferret fur around the edges. The robe was extremely wide and almost dragged to the ground. The young girl looked in their direction with eyes as blue as the sea, and just a dignified gaze was enough to silence the maids. They took half a step back and let go of Scarlet, bowing respectfully, leaving Scarlet standing in place uneasily, not knowing whether she should do as she was told. "Are you the person they brought back from the south?" Constance the Silver Queen asked. Her voice was like a string of silver bells falling on the marble floor of the corridor, ethereal and crisp. She looked at Scarlet with a strange light in her eyes. "What a beauty! My name is Scarlet. May I ask, where is this place?" Scarlet asked in a low voice. She saw that the girl was a few years younger than herself, and the uneasiness in her heart subsided a little. She didn't think that her words would scare the maids behind her half to death. Although Her Majesty the Empress was a woman, she was colder and more emotionless than a man. They had never seen anyone who dared to speak so impudently to Her Majesty. They were afraid that this countess would accidentally anger this temperamental supreme being. But Constance did not mind. She smiled and said, "This is my palace." "What did you say?" Scarlet looked at her blankly. The maidservants who were chattering before turned pale. Her Majesty's words were so obvious, but the Countess, who did not seem to care about worldly affairs, still asked, "What did you say?" What was the difference between this and calling Her Majesty's name in front of her? They could almost imagine Her Majesty's angry face, followed by the accusation and anger that would follow. They could not help but tremble like leaves in the wind. But unlike what they imagined, Constance found it very interesting. She had never seen such a simple girl in her decades of life in the palace. She looked at Scarlet, who seemed to be stunned, and a sense of pride rose in her heart. She smiled a little mischievously and said, "You didn't hear wrong. This is the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace. I think you should have heard of this place. As for me, if I were to say that this entire palace and even the vast land outside of it belongs to me, I'm afraid that no one would raise any objections." Constance thought that those words should have scared the poor girl out of her wits, but what she did not expect was that those words did not have as much effect on Scarlet as the previous one. That was because the mountain maiden knew what "this is my palace" meant, but she did not know the deeper meaning behind the Garden of White Roses in St. Cantifer Palace. Under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, anyone with a little knowledge would have heard of the center of power of the Cruz Empire, the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace. But unfortunately, Scarlet, who grew up in the Chablis forest since she was young, was the rare exception. This place with a strong political connotation was no different from Front Gate 35 of Valhalla or the gatehouse of the Baron's Castle on the main street of Abbey's Castle. Constance looked at the Highlander girl with a little disappointment. She blinked and asked her a little uneasily, "But why am I here?" "I was the one who asked someone to invite you here." The Silver Queen was, after all, a queen. This momentary and failed prank was like a whirlpool on the surface of water in her heart, disappearing in the blink of an eye. This sentence made Scarlet fall silent. Constance's words seemed to have injected countless chaotic memory fragments into her mind, connecting the missing pieces and forming a complete chain. She finally remembered what happened after Ovina sealed her in the invincible barrier to protect her, as well as everything that truly existed in that dream. She was transported from Lantern Island to the sea, and then passed through Grey Harbor and Yenbao. She passed through half of the empire and arrived at the political center of the empire. Finally, she was released from the crystal in the Holy Cathedral. Although she still didn't quite understand how she became a countess for no reason, she wasn't an idiot. At this moment, she realized who the young lady standing in front of her was. "Your Majesty," she answered with obvious unease. Constance nodded with satisfaction. The maids behind Scarlet finally breathed a sigh of relief. They almost patted their chests in relief. It seemed that the Count was not too stupid after all. However, Scarlet was obviously going to go against them until the end, because her next words immediately caused their mood, which had just climbed out of the abyss, to plummet to the bottom of the abyss. Constance watched as Scarlet fell silent in front of her. She frowned and clenched her fists. She raised her eyebrows slightly and asked, "I invited you here and made you a Count of the Empire. You don't seem to want to?" "I don't want to be a Count, Your Majesty. I just want to go back to Erewhon." The maids almost fainted when they heard their Count's words, if they were allowed to, but they were still facing Her Majesty the Empress. They could only tremble in fear, grit their teeth, and hope from the bottom of their hearts that their Count would not say anything outrageous. Constance also seemed to be a little unhappy. She asked, "Why do you want to go back to Erewhon? Is it because you want to go back to that Count of yours? I heard that the Count is still a young man. A young man, a romantic and unrestrained person. It's only natural for a young lady like you to have feelings for him." She shook her head, "But you have to understand that you and him are destined to have no future. He has a bright future ahead of him. How could he possibly fall for you? In the future, the one who will be in his bed will either be the daughter of a duke or your princess. You, on the other hand, are destined to be a mistress who can't see the light of day. Ask yourself, is that what you want?" Scarlet widened her eyes and stared at the girl who looked a few years younger than her. She wanted to refute, but she could not open her mouth. No, in her mind, the Count was definitely not that kind of person. But what difference did it make to her? The Count already had a fiancé. The only thing she could do was to watch it all happen in silence. The Silver Queen's words pierced her heart like a sharp thorn. To be the Count's mistress, she suddenly realized that she seemed to have such delusions. "No, no, Scarlet, you can't think like that." She hurriedly shook her head and said to herself in her heart. The Highlander girl looked up, her cheeks were already boiling hot. Constance looked on coldly and then asked, "Do you still want to go back?" Scarlet nodded. Constance's face turned cold. "Do you think I'll let the Azure Lance leave the Empire, little girl? I'd rather destroy it than let such a thing happen." Her voice was so cold that it was penetrating. The majesty of a supreme being that had accumulated over the years almost made the Highlander girls behind Scarlet tremble. They were like sifting chaff, as if they would collapse at any time. But Scarlet stubbornly looked at Her Majesty. Her gaze seemed to have answered the question. Even if she died, she would die by Brando's side. Constance did not find it difficult to feel her determination. She snorted coldly, "It's not hard for you to die, but aren't you afraid of dragging your Count down with you? He has a bright future ahead of him." The Highlander girl trembled, clenching her fists and looking at her angrily. Constance looked at Scarlet and could not help but shake her head. She looked up and said to the frightened maids, "You can leave now." The maids hurriedly bowed and retreated, but they could not help but sneak glances at Scarlet before they left, as if they were afraid that the Countess, who did not care about worldly affairs, would offend Her Majesty too much and accidentally lose her head. The round-faced maid even risked her life to grab Scarlet's hand and gave it a squeeze. This little gesture naturally fell into Constance's eyes, but the young queen completely ignored it. After the maids had all left, she said, "Although it's the first time we met, I can see that they care about you. Do you know the situation of the Highlanders in the Empire?" Scarlet was not a puppet, and naturally could feel the concern from the girls of her tribe. She was slightly touched but still did not say a word. "What a stubborn little girl," Constance replied, "but there is no benefit for you to insist on this. You are a Count of the Empire today and you will always be a Count of the Empire. Whether you accept this identity or not, you will have to pledge your loyalty to my sword." She then warned, "I can tell you clearly, Scarlet, from today onwards, if you dare to take half a step out of the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace, I will send troops to attack Erewhon and hang your beloved Count." Scarlet's face was pale as she stared at her in disbelief. However, the Empire's queen did not seem to mind and continued, "Of course, when you swear your loyalty to me, I will give you the land of the wilderness of the Four Realms as your fief. But remember, you don't have much time left. You don't want to gamble the future of your Lord Brando, do you?" When the Highlander girl heard that name, her whole body became wobbly. For a moment, she felt like the world was spinning, and her heart was at a loss. But she did not know where the courage came from, but she suddenly gritted her teeth and raised her hand. The emerald holy spear suddenly appeared in her hand. She let out a beastly growl and raised the spear to stab Constance's abdomen. The azure spear almost pierced through the Silver Queen, and at that moment, Scarlet seemed to have lost all her strength. She gasped for breath, but when she looked up, she saw that Constance's face showed no signs of pain. Instead, she looked at her coldly and said, "My countess, is this your answer?" "You." Scarlet looked at the spear in her hand in a daze. Constance raised a hand and placed it on the azure spear, and then pulled the blade out of her body inch by inch. She looked at her blood-stained abdomen, and then looked at the Highlander girl and shook her head in disappointment. "You are recognized by the Azure Knight. You and your azure spear can't hurt me. Go, you need to wake up. But remember my words, if you dare to act rashly again, I'll be the first to kill Erwin." Scarlet was almost scared out of her wits, and she looked like she was at a loss. "Guards!" Constance covered her abdomen with one hand and shouted coldly, "Take Count Mitra away." In just a moment, the Silver Queen watched the guards take Scarlet away, and finally there was a look of unwillingness in her eyes. She gently bared her teeth, and only then did she release the hand on her abdomen. Her palm was already blood-red. However, she did not summon a priest or a doctor. Instead, she looked behind a bush in the garden and said coldly, "Come out, what are you sneaking around for?" In just a moment, the bush there rustled, and a person in the attire of a chamberlain came out. The person looked at Her Majesty with some fear and asked respectfully, "Your Majesty, are you all right? Do you want—" "Who told you that you can talk glibly in front of me?" Constance interrupted him. "What are you doing hiding there? Are all the people outside who sent the message dead?" "Your Majesty, of course not, because it's a secret message from the wilderness of the Four Realms." The person was shocked and quickly answered submissively. "A secret message from the wilderness of the Four Realms." Constance frowned. "What's the matter with the elves again?" The person quickly came closer and whispered a few words into her ear. Constance listened, and her face darkened slightly. "Is this letter absolutely authentic?" "Yes, Your Majesty." In the north of Yanallasu and the Grey Mountains, the Lion Men's attacks were decreasing day by day. This situation was very unusual as the situation in the north was getting more and more tense by the day. The human scouts headed north, and soon found an unprecedented army on the grasslands. This army was gathering from all directions and was now heading north, approaching the Anthbar Pass. This news quickly crossed the glittering sea, crossed Ampere Seal in the south, and went deep into the interior, and spread to those who needed it. Brando. When the princess called out to Brando in the courtyard, he was preparing a saddle for the horse. Brando saw Princess Griffin coming out of the house and could not help but be slightly startled. "Your Highness, I was just about to go to your place. Are you here to say goodbye to me?" Brando scratched his head in a very ungentlemanly manner. Although he did intend to do so, it was quite awkward to be pointed out by the princess. Speaking of which, this was his home and the princess was his guest. It was a little rude to leave her alone while he was in a hurry to return to his territory. But now was not the time for him to care about his manners. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. My subordinate has been missing for quite some time and I have to hurry." He could only answer in this way. Princess Griffin was slightly dissatisfied. "That evening when you slammed the door in my study, you were not so polite." "I slammed the door?" Brando was shocked. If he dared to slam the door in front of the princess, he would not be able to escape the title of a powerful official. That night he was just too lazy to talk nonsense with Makarov and left first. How did it turn into slamming the door? Princess Griffin looked at him quietly. "Brando, you and the royal faction have different views. This is not a big deal and I understand your ideals. But the old nobles are deeply rooted in the kingdom, and the royal faction is also a part of them. You have offended them time and time again, and they may not let you go." Brendel was a little disdainful. He knew too well about the old nobles that the princess was talking about in his previous life. They were a bunch of useless people. The royal faction was considered to have some achievements among them, but that was all there was to it. He shrugged. "I'm just expressing my opinion. As for the courage of Mr. Makarov and the others, I admire it very much, but I don't dare to compliment them. Today Cruz can take away one person from the kingdom and tomorrow they can take away even more. If Erwin can't even protect its people, then what dignity does this ancient kingdom have?" "I understand," Griffin replied. "But Brando, what do you plan to do? Do you really want to declare war on the Empire? Are you here to dissuade me, Your Highness?" Griffin shook her head lightly. "I can't dissuade you, but I believe you know what to do, right, Brando?" Brendel could hear the helplessness in Her Highness's tone, and his momentum could not help but weaken a little. Showing off in front of a lady did not seem to be something to be proud of. He was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, "I'm not that blind yet. Whether the war or not depends on the attitude of the Empire, but I have to bring my subordinates back from the hands of the Kurluts. After that, It's hard to say if Her Majesty the Queen will be furious. But no matter what, Erwin needs to be prepared for war. The princess let out a sigh of relief. I knew you would know what to do. She paused for a moment. Then I'll appoint you as the leader of Erwin's diplomatic group. What do you think, Count? Brando saw the princess looking up at him, and there seemed to be a cunning glint in her silver eyes. He couldn't help but be a little surprised. Diplomatic group? What diplomatic group? He couldn't wrap his head around it for a moment. Could it be that in order to get back the hostages, the princess even formed a diplomatic group to denounce the empire? Wait, isn't this a little too ridiculous? He originally wanted to bring a small group of people to sneak into the empire and secretly rescue Scarlet, but the princess' idea was much better than his. This was a slap to the empire's face. Your Highness, this is a little inappropriate. Brendel was taken aback and carefully chose his words before replying. What? Well? Brendel thought about it and felt that this princess might be a little too idealistic. He had to explain, the Kurlutzians are still quite prideful and the Silver Queen is even more so. If we do this, won't we put them in a difficult position? What are you thinking, Brando? The princess looked at him in surprise. I'm asking you to be the envoy of the participating countries of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to go to Erwin in the Holy War. Holy War? Brando couldn't help but cry out. The Holy War has begun? P.S. Today's chapter is 6,000 words again, so I'm a little late. Everyone please vote, it's the end of the month again. Also, tomorrow is the Sword Spirit Open Beta. If you want to play, you can come to the Bamboo Forest Coast. I'm the unapproachable Fergie, the 36th assassin. Let's play together. Chapter 897. The First Holy War generally referred to the War of the Holy Saints that took place 1,000 years ago. The 4 Holy Saints led the people of Black Iron to resist the cruel rule of the Dark Dragon. It was a glorious and sacred war praised by countless songs. The Second Holy War began at the end of the Year of Chaos. It was a sacred war launched by the Fanzan, the Crews, and the Wind Elves to open up the vast wilderness and dark forest between the 3 kingdoms. That was the era of the Pioneer Knight. The magnificent and heroic songs in the wilderness lasted until the establishment of Erwin. After that, the territories of the 3 empires were basically formed. The only thing left between the kingdoms was the narrow dark forest as a buffer zone. This war was also magnificent and lasted for nearly 2 centuries. Thus, the name of the Holy War was established. The Third Holy War began in the Year of Glory and lasted for nearly half a century. However, it turned out that this war was neither glorious nor honorable, especially the November War in the last 7 years. Bloodshed became the only memory people had of this war. The reason for the start of the war was the magical technology brought by the Hazel people. The introduction of the new technology made the kingdoms enter the most prosperous era. However, the hidden dangers brought by the expansion of the population also appeared one by one. When the population began to flow into the borders, the empires had to turn their attention to the remaining undeveloped areas. Since the Year of Glory, the 3 empires, in accordance with the Sacred Covenant, jointly marched to the border of the wilderness of 4 territories. The war began in the south of the Alkash Mountains, but it turned out to be a terrible mistake. Throughout the war, because of the contradictions of land division, the distrust of the royal family, and the growing conflict between the teachings of the Holy Cathedral, and the all-for-one believers who stirred up trouble and bewitched people's hearts, in the 320th year of the First Era, the Year of Change, the local army of the Crews people suddenly attacked the Wind Elves, who were their allies. On the surface, this battle was revenge for an earlier conflict, but there was no lack of all-for-one shadows. Then the human army on the Wind Elves' side also retaliated, completely intensifying the conflict. Humans and Wind Elves fought each other on the long and narrow battlefield. All-for-one's high-ranking nobles who had infiltrated the Society of Order played an indispensable role in the battle, but when most of the nobles came to their senses, the result was already too late. But in fact, in a way, it reflected the human heart. The scholar of Rune Castle, Ron Similian, wrote in his book, "People too often shift the blame to some evil force, instead of reflecting on their own mistakes." In fact, history has long proven that this force only played a role in the whole process of the war, but it only exposed the ugly side of human nature. This statement described the scene of the war at that time. After 6 months, the Fanzan people joined the war, and then the Lion people of Toquinin, duchies and kingdoms of all sizes were drawn into the vortex. The war dragged all the participants into an endless battle because of hatred, greed or other reasons, until they exhausted each other. After the war, the Cruz people occupied the entire wilderness of the Four Realms and a small part of the Four-Leaf Clover Plains, including a large piece of land that originally belonged to the Wind Elves. The Fanzan people were the biggest winners, reaping benefits from both sides. The Lion people solved their need for hatred, and many duchies were enslaved in the war, either because of the greed of the imperial nobles, or because of the war's progress. On the surface, it seemed that the Second Holy War had ended around the Year of the Cave Beasts, but in fact, the seeds of deeper hatred had been planted long ago. The last trust between the empires was lost, and the friction on the border was increasing day by day. Almost everyone knew that the three beasts just needed a short rest because they had lost their strength, and each of them could not wait to jump up and bite each other to death. The Cruz people needed to pay for the blood shed by the nobles in the last 7 years of the November War. Although they gained benefits from the war, it was more painful. This pain made the nobles become impetuous and angry, and made them want to free themselves from the dishonorable war, and punish the Fanzan people and the Wind Elves. This atmosphere made the Cruz people to increase their exploitation of the small countries, and also allowed the All-for-One to infiltrate a wider market. However, for the Wind Elves, it was also a deep-rooted hatred, whether it was for the Fanzan people or the Cruz people. They lost their territory in the war, and naturally they wanted to take it back. The Fanzan people, the only ones who wanted to maintain the results of the last war, gradually became impatient because of the constant provocation from the Cruz people and the Wind Elves on the border. The Fourth Holy War, or rather the Third Holy War. Due to the disreputable influence of the Third Holy War, more and more people were unwilling to associate the subsequent holy wars with the War of the Holy Saints, especially scholars. Many of them did not regard the War of the Holy Saints as the same kind of war for territorial expansion, but took it out from history and put it aside. Therefore, the pain caused by the Second Holy War was destined to break out in the Third Holy War. This was something that all countries had expected, but when it really started, it was earlier than everyone expected. At the end of July, the deadly frost forest exploded. On the same day, Toquinin, Voles, and Perkins were bombarded by the 14 Circle Spell God's judgment. The casualties were countless, and the 3 cities were almost reduced to ashes. Within the next 2 months, the Golden Lion Mane Beastmen began to gather an army. Their attack started from the Grey Mountain Range in the south, Yanalasu, and crossed the White Plains and began to march towards Kurlutz. At the beginning of the month of frost, the Lion Mane Beastmen left the warm plains and arrived at the Lion Fortress. News of the coming war spread throughout the Kurlutz Empire within half a month. In the same month, the Wind Elves' revenge army set out from the ruins of Perkins and ambushed the Cruz people's Crimson Army on the Four-Leaf Grass Plain. The Wind Elves quickly recovered several towns and fortresses on the Four-Leaf Grass Plain, and entered a stalemate with the Cruz people on the border of the Wilderness of Four Realms. As for the Fanzan people, although they did not act on the surface, their army had already begun to gather from White City and Grey Hues. When Constance and Vala's order to summon the envoys and nobles of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to Rushta arrived, Brando knew that the second chapter of the game, the Age of War and Chaos, had come early. Her Royal Highness decided on the candidates for the envoys in the shortest time possible. First of all, the leader of the envoys was naturally Brando. Although there were many voices of dissent in the royal faction, Griffin suppressed all of them. She knew the real purpose of Brando's trip, and she supported the Earl's decision. Most of the opponents of the royal faction thought that this was a childish and impulsive action, but she did not think so. Brando's words of, "This is the pride and backbone of a nation," finally moved her. She knew that the kingdom needed some pride of its own. Griffin knew that such a flag would allow her to gain some people who truly supported her, and not those cowardly nobles. They had already parted ways with her in Ampere Seal, and she did not have the slightest bit of hope in her heart. If the nobles of a kingdom did not stand with her, then she should at least stand with its citizens. Brando's words were like a beacon in the darkness for her. Next, the Royal Highness still stubbornly chose Haruz. This made Brando feel a little flattered. He was very clear about the rules between the nobles of Wond, so he was also very clear about the reason why the Royal Highness made this choice. It was because Haruz was the future Crown Prince of Erewhon, and Cruz could not detain him in the Empire. Otherwise, the Silver Queen would not only offend all of her vassal states, but also leave a very bad reputation among the nobles of the Empire. But there were still some risks in doing so. The Crown Prince's travels were full of unstable factors, and Prince Leneret, who was still living in seclusion in Tonajul, was a ready-made example. But Griffin was determined to let her beloved brother take the risk to protect Brando, the head of the diplomatic mission, because she knew very well what Brando meant to Erewhon at this moment. If he died in Cruz, then her and Haru's future would also be bleak. She was very clear about what she was going to do, and in her opinion as the future king of Erewhon, it was also time for Haruz to take responsibility for the future of the kingdom. This was what she said to her only brother. Haruz, this diplomatic experience of you and your teacher is likely to be the most precious wealth of your life. Haruz, this may be the last time I tell you that you have to be strong alone because you are the king of Erewhon. The little prince had no objection, but he was frightened by his sister's sternness and almost cried. But when Princess Griffin glared at him fiercely, he swallowed his tears back into his stomach and nodded honestly. Brando, on the other hand, returned to Tanajul with some gratitude to the princess and began to choose the attendants and deputies who would accompany him. He knew very well that this so-called diplomatic mission was just a pretense. What he really wanted to do was clear to everyone around him. Therefore, this so-called diplomatic mission did not need etiquette officers full of aristocratic etiquette, but an army that could turn Cruz upside down. This army did not have many people, and he already had a suitable candidate in mind. Since almost all the funds in the territory have been invested in the preparation for war, mainly the recruitment and training of the White Lion Guards, the forging of weapons and armor, and the expenditure of magic crystals, daily maintenance, the acquisition of rare materials, etc. In short, the construction in the Black Forest has basically come to a halt. This situation will last for about 3 to 4 months, and at the latest in half a year, our previous achievements will be shaken. The carriage was shaking, and the shadows of the forest passed through the window, leaving mottled patterns on the black robes as the carriage moved forward. Brando's face was bright and dark under the crisscrossing light. He supported his chin with one hand as he listened to the merchant lady read a report to him, which was rare for the little Roman. Her small eyebrows were knitted together. As part of her interest as a merchant, she did not mind reading a mountain of books or similar documents, but reading them out loud and turning them into audiobooks, she began to feel a little thirsty. But this was what Brando wanted her to do. She used this reason to convince herself for about 5 minutes or 10 seconds, but she immediately found a new excuse. Brando always liked to see her in a difficult position, and this made her very unhappy. The Roman began to realize that the Roman was unhappy. She raised her feathery eyebrows and quickly moved her mouth as she read, "The White Lion Guards suffered about 100 casualties in the previous war." Brando glared at her. "Wait, what did you say in the second half? I didn't hear you clearly." "That's what I said in the second half, isn't it? It's just that I read it too fast so you didn't hear it clearly. But I finished reading it." Romaine began to act shamelessly as usual. "You're cheating. Didn't you say that you would read the report to me this afternoon? I have to know what happened in the territory during this time." Brando replied in a bad mood. "But I've already finished reading it. I used the method my aunt taught me, the witch's reading method." If Brando didn't hear it clearly, then Brando isn't a witch. That has nothing to do with the Roman. She rolled her black eyes and stuffed a stack of reports into Falern's hands. "But you can let Falern read it for you. She doesn't know the witch's reading method, so Brando doesn't have to worry about not hearing it clearly." Brendel was sure that the witch's ability to read things so quickly must have popped up from some random corner of her brain, but this merchant girl's imagination was too rich, to the point that she could use the same name differently. He rolled his eyes and was too lazy to expose her, because she would definitely be able to justify herself in the end. This was Lord Romaine's special skill, rolling all over the floor, and normal people would not be able to learn it. He looked at Falern, who was sitting opposite the two of them, ignoring the two clowns in front of her. She silently tidied up the report and continued to read. "The White Lion Guard's casualties have been replenished by new recruits from the Tanajul and Maxen region. In addition, the new recruits have been expanded by 500 people, making a total of 1,500 people. However, these new recruits are still training in Tanajul and Randner, so they won't be able to be used for the time being." "Good job, Carglass," Brando praised. The scenery outside the carriage had already changed to a tranquil mountain forest. It was already the second day since he returned to Tanajul. He stretched himself in the carriage and found that he felt more relaxed after returning to his territory. Although it was very warm in Braggs's house, it was still very awkward in front of his father. After all, this was his territory that he built with his own hands. He originally wanted his parents to move to Tanajul, but old Scott stubbornly refused to accept. His mother, Windsor, seemed to be tempted, but in the end she did not agree. Fortunately, Bun-Eyed promised to send people to take care of his family. With the protection of the Highland Knight, he did not have to worry about Madara's possible revenge. In the end, Princess Griffin did not succeed in her resignation. Since Princess Griffin arranged for him to be the leader of the diplomatic group to cruise, she naturally had to personally come to Tanajul to inspect the group that he selected to go to the Empire. She wanted to prevent the Count from bringing an army to cruise. Of course, this was only an excuse on the surface. In fact, it was somewhat against the rules for the princess to go to a vassal's territory in private. It would also negatively affect her reputation. However, everyone knew that Tanajul and Radnor's territories were close to Frada. It was not unreasonable for her to insist on taking a detour from Tanajul. However, Brando knew that Her Royal Highness would not leave easily after coming to Abes this time. His departure from Erewhon to cruise was an unstable factor in the kingdom's situation. At least on the surface, in the eyes of the world, Tanajul was still standing behind the princess. If he, Count Tanajul, was not in the kingdom for a short period of time, then she was likely to face the danger of being taken over by the royal faction again. She came to his territory this time with the mentality of inspecting the rear, and also to show the world that she had a close relationship with the Count of Tanajul. Brando did not think too much about these considerations of the princess at first. He only thought that the princess was here to bid him farewell, but after Amandina's reminder, he understood. In fact, Tanajul and the royal family were interdependent. When he was not in the kingdom, his territory especially needed to be recognized by the royal family. This was related to the legitimacy of the territory, and to prevent the royal faction from taking advantage of the situation. Thus, after understanding the princess' considerations, he tacitly began to cooperate with her. For this reason, Princess Griffin conferred him the title of Count Randner on the first day she arrived in Tanajul. This was actually a compensation title, because Tanajul was never a count's territory. Originally, Brando did not have any ambitions for Randner. In his original plan, it was best for Randner and Erek to be merged into the royal family's territory to further strengthen the central authority, and also to set an example for other places. Furthermore, Erek had the second best source of soldiers in the kingdom, the Highlanders. Erewhon's main source of soldiers came from the Grey Mountains, and Randner was the most prosperous territory in the south other than Ampere Seal. With these two territories, the royal family could be said to have a significant say in Erewhon. As for himself, the title of Count Tanajul was just a pretense. The land of order in the loop of trade winds was almost half the size of the southern border, and when it was fully developed, it would not be difficult to create another Erewhon. The key was that it contained a lot of valuable minerals and resources, so he had no interest in managing other territories. However, Princess Griffin dispelled his thoughts. She sternly told him that the title of Count was not only a reward, but also a recognition. With his current status and relationship with her, if he did not receive the title of Count Randner today, it would easily arouse suspicion from the outside world, and cause unrest in the kingdom. Not only would it not strengthen the royal family's authority, but it would also cause the reputation of the House of Covardo to fall to the ground, and at the same time, it would also shake the legitimacy of Tanajul. After listening to her explanation, Brando realized that his thoughts were a little too naive, and he had no choice but to follow her advice. After receiving Count Randner's title, he also received a portion of the command rights of the Southern Legion. The expansion of the Southern Legion was carried out under this name. Princess Griffin pretended not to see it, and did not mention a word about the ownership of the Southern Army that was currently recuperating in Ampere Seal. Brando also pretended to forget this point, and the two maintained a tacit understanding to put on this show. The outsiders thought that these two young people did not understand the workings of the kingdom's local forces, and almost no one, including the royal faction, reminded them of this point. It was as if they were waiting to see them make a fool of themselves. However, many people in Trentheim understood that their liege had obviously received some sort of instruction, and was preparing to clean up the mess caused by the nobles in the southern border, the mutual restraint and hindrance between the forces of the armies. However, this plan had just begun, and Brando had no choice but to put it aside and hand it over to Carglass or Princess Griffin. After all, Cruz's people had caused a lot of trouble for him. He interrupted the wild elf sister in front of him and asked directly, "In terms of preparations for war, we can slow down a little bit. If we really want to go to war with Cruz's people, it will not be just Tanajul's problem, and Princess Griffin will find a way to help. The focus of resources and funds should be placed on Valhalla. Falern, if I need to use all the Valkyries, how long can the territory last? If we slow down the pace of other aspects, with the supply of magic crystals in the Black Forest, it should not be a problem to last for a year, my lord." Falern replied without a change in her expression. "What if we want to maintain the construction in the Black Forest? 3 months to half a year." Brando nodded. What about the materials that you want to purchase? Currently there are only phoenix wings and singing silver and they are very scarce. As for the other materials that my lord wants, there is no news yet. Falerne looked at him and said. Author's note: these few chapters have been a little difficult to write, and because of the long duration of the plot, I uploaded them a little late. Please forgive me. Also, seeing that I have been working hard for the past few days, I ask for monthly votes. Chapter 899. The carriage soon arrived at Valhalla and stopped in the central district after passing through a gate on the huge tree roots. Brando looked at the scenery outside and gestured to Falerne to stop. He opened the door, jumped out of the carriage, and saw the little prince waiting not far away. Teacher. Haruz bowed respectfully to Brando with the courtesy a student should have. Behind him stood Maynard, and another figure in a white linen robe who looked like an ancient Greek goddess, but with snake hair and prismatic eyes. She was a Medusa. Brando had heard of this Medusa named Lysimachia, but today was the first time he met her face to face. Your Highness, how has your swordsmanship improved in the past 2 months? Haruz's face turned red and he could not answer. It didn't seem to be very good. Brando smiled and patted the little prince on the shoulder. Don't worry, it's okay. At this time, several green vines hung down from the canopy of Valhalla, hundreds of meters high. These vines were as thick as an arm, and the ends were intertwined to form a basket. Brando let Haruz, Maynard, and the little Roman ride in one basket with him, and the rest of the people ride in another. After he gave an order, the vines began to rise slowly. Although it was not the first time the little Roman had taken this kind of transportation, she was still looking around excitedly. She swung the rattan basket in the air and shouted, scaring Haruz so much that he clutched the edge of the basket tightly. But when it reached a certain height, the merchant girl also clutched the edge of the basket tightly and obediently stayed still. Swordsmanship is not everything, Haruz. Brando looked at the gradually shrinking hills and brown forest under his feet and continued the previous topic. If I remember correctly, after next month you will be 13 years old. Haruz looked at his teacher with some confusion and nodded. Starting next month I will teach you magic. Magic? Haruz was slightly stunned. I can learn magic too, teacher? Of course. Brando nodded and said no more. Suddenly, he felt a gaze on him and realized that Maynard was staring at him. The female knight seemed to have recovered from her injuries. Today she was wearing a tight military uniform and looked very heroic. What's wrong, miss? Maynard? Brando asked. You plan to teach His Royal Highness magic? Have you reported this to Her Royal Highness? Maynard asked. Not yet, but Haruz is very talented in magic. He has wasted too much time on the path of swordsmanship. Why not try another path? 13 years old is too late to learn swordsmanship, but it is the right time to learn magic. Who knows, he might become an outstanding wizard in the future. He laughed. As for Her Royal Highness, I will report this to her. The rattan basket quickly rose to the top. There were many wooden trestles extending from the central square, making it convenient for the people in the rattan basket to step on. Amandina, who had arrived at Valhalla first, was already waiting for them. She was holding a pile of unknown parchments, and behind her was Tia and the rest of the Tiger Sparrow mercenaries. When she saw Brando, Roman, and Falerne, Tia was pleasantly surprised and called out to her sister. Amandina gave him a look. Brando understood and asked, They're here? Amandina nodded her head. Where are they? Brando asked. Lady Tanya doesn't like noisy places, so I arranged for her to rest in the side hall. If she didn't like noisy places, why would she open a shop in downtown Ampere Seal? Brando shook his head in confusion. Let's go see her first. As expected, the nominal owner of the item arrived as scheduled. When Amandina pushed open an arched door with a carved pattern on the surface, a fairy lady was sitting peacefully on the round wooden table in the side hall. She knelt on the cushion. A small cushion was specially prepared for her on the table. On a tea table the size of a box was a small white porcelain tea set filled with fragrant tea. When she saw Brando and the others behind Amandina, she turned back, held the teacup with both hands, took a sip, and then gently put it down. The council is very dissatisfied, little one. The fairy lady's first words silenced the hall. Medusa Lysimachia stared at the silver star brooch on the fairy lady's chest as if she had been pricked. Originally, not everyone agreed to leave the azure lance with you for protection. It was Master William and I who found a way to persuade the council to stand against the majority, but now you've put us in a passive position. Aunt Tanya, this isn't all our fault. I think you should understand that. Brando motioned for Ferlin to close the door and replied innocently, Back then, you promised me that the illusion you cast on the azure lance would never be seen through by anyone, unless that person was a living sage. But now that living sage is still in Eloranta, and your lance has been stolen by Cruz's people. Tanya raised her eyelids and looked at him with some surprise through her silver-rimmed glasses. Don't talk nonsense, little one. If you hadn't used it to deal with a real god, how could the illusion on the azure lance have dissipated? But Scarlet wasn't around at the time. If it can't even withstand a little fluctuation of divine power, I think this so-called strongest illusion is a bit too unworthy of its name, isn't it? If I tell Luo and what you said exactly, do you think he'll come looking for you like a mad lion? Tanya was almost amused by this sophistry. A little fluctuation of divine power from your mouth destroyed 3 cities and blew up the deadly tundra into a barren land. Don't think we don't know. She knocked on the white porcelain teacup and asked, "This cup is good. Why do you have a fairy tea set here? Did you prepare it especially for me?" "That's for the light spirits." Brando glanced at the tea set and answered casually. "You're just like your grandfather. You don't know how to make a woman happy at all." Tanya rolled her eyes at him. "The council means that the azure lance must be taken back. Isn't that simple?" Brando continued. "With your strength, you can easily subdue the holy cathedral of fire. The azure lance is ours to begin with. In this matter, Cruz's people are the ones in the wrong. If you come forward and ask them to return it, I'm sure they won't dare to refuse." "Naive little one, it's not that simple," Tanya replied. "Although Buga is the most powerful country in the world, Cruz's people are not to be underestimated. The land under the control of the Holy Cathedral of Fire is vast and the population is large. The enmity between two such large forces involves a series of complicated issues, not to mention war. To tell you the truth, little one, the possibility of persuading the council is 0. Then you want to take back the azure lance, don't you?" Brando said softly, "I see. You're counting on me again." The fairy squinted at him. "Stop pretending. You already knew, didn't you?" Brando smiled without embarrassment. "But Aunt Tanya, you can see that I can't be a match for the behemoth that is the Cruz Empire, unless someone is helping Erwin behind the scenes." "Apart from direct intervention Tanya began. "Apart from direct intervention Brando repeated affirmatively. "Tell us, what do you want us to do?" Brando gestured to Amandina, who was beside him. Amandina hurriedly unfolded the rolls of parchment she had been holding in her arms and spread them on the table. They were several drawings. The fairy flipped them open one by one and understood after reading them. "Cruz's frigate. You want us to help you build this thing?" She leaned over the drawings and looked back at Brando. Brando nodded, then shook his head. "I want you to help me build 10 of these frigates. Of course you'll pay for them. But more than that, I want you to help me build a large magic dock in Valhalla. This magic dock must have the technical standards after the Year of Thunder. It must be able to build at least the smallest Type 4 battleships. The dock must have a gargoyle casting workshop that can provide at least a brigade of gargoyles for the dock and port as an air defense force. At the same time, you'll also help this dock train the 3rd phase of shipwrights and supporting professional wizards." Tanya glanced at him in surprise. "You seem to know a lot about magic shipbuilding?" "A little," Brando replied somewhat proudly. "I just don't want to be deceived." "A piece of cake. Any city in Buga has the ability to build a dock like this for you alone. We won't go as far as to cheat for something like this." Tanya casually flipped through the Cruz frigate drawings that Brando and Amandina regarded as treasures. She replied with some disdain. "Only you would look up to this kind of rubbish drawings." "Rubbish? Cruz's technology comes from the Wind Elves. Don't tell me you don't know who taught the Wind Elves their magic warship technology?" Of course Brando knew. In this world, only Buga's craftsmen could have such confidence. One of the 2 poles of Won's magic engineering technology was now in front of him. He took a light breath and asked, "Are you saying that you can help us build a Type 1 battleship? The Dragon of Akagash class?" "How do you know about the Dragon of Akagash class?" Tanya asked with some surprise. "Of course not. The Dragon of Akagash class was the latest type of battleship that Buga had been building since the Cold Moon era. It was also the revolutionary main ship of the future Slate War. Of course Brando did not count on it. It was just a casual remark. He asked again, "What about the older ones?" "That's also impossible." "What about the frigate?" Tanya shook her head. "Little guy, just give up. The Silver Council only cares about themselves. It's already an exception that they're willing to help you. It's impossible to convince those old guys. Even if they help you build a magic dock, They can only use the Wind Elves or Cruz's technology. As for the gargoyles, anyway, it's already leaked technology before the Second Holy War, so it won't be too difficult. As for the rest, don't think too much. Sigh. Brando sighed as if he had already expected this. If that's the case, Aunt Tanya, why do you have to ignite my hope? Because you're an idiot, the fairy replied snappily. Although we can't do it, someone else can. Who? The Hazel people. The Hazel people are Cruz's mortal enemies. If one day you really stand on the opposite side of the Empire, I can find a way to contact them for you. I'm sure those arrogant shorties will be happy to help you become a thorn in the Empire's side. She glanced at Brando and replied, You don't look down on their technology, do you? Of course I look down on them. Brando reacted and was overjoyed. What a joke, one of the two extremes of magic technology. How would he dare to look down on it? It's just that the Hazel people had little contact with the outside world, so he didn't dare to think about it. Tanya patted the blueprint and asked again, So, this is all you want? Brando immediately shook his head. Of course not, Aunt Tanya. Naturally, I can't take 10 frigates to the Empire to take back the Azure Lance. This previous request is only the premise of our cooperation. It's to guard against the possible retaliation the Empire may launch against Erwin after I take back the Azure Lance. And I'm going to take back the Azure Lance. This is a difficult task in itself, and I need your unreserved support. The fairy looked at him with a look that said, I knew you would say that, and said, You're not going to say that you need a battleship to go to the Empire to take back the Azure Lance, are you? Brando smiled awkwardly. Obviously she had hit the nail on the head. He hurriedly shook his head and said, Of course not. I just want some small things, Aunt Tanya. After reaching a preliminary consensus, the subsequent discussion was much easier. Of course this ease was relative to one side. When the 2-hour bargaining process flashed by, Brando was satisfied, but Tanya's expression did not look good. If your grandfather was half as smart as you, he wouldn't have ended up like that. These were the original words of a certain fairy. Of course, although she seemed very dissatisfied, she still accepted Brando's request to stay for the banquet hosted by Valhalla. After all, both sides knew very well that these deals were just a drop in the ocean for Buga. And when Amandina followed Brando out of the side hall of Valhalla's town hall, she couldn't help but wonder if she was still in a dream. Although she had long been used to big scenes, she still asked Brando in a low voice in disbelief, My lord, Lady Tanya really agreed to give us 1,000 gargoyles? Brando nodded. And 300 steel golems? Brando nodded again. And ether dragons? Brando probably guessed the thoughts of his lady aide. He turned back and replied, We're just helping the Buga deal with the inventory. These things are outdated technology to them. Every year they're overstocked in the warehouse and they need to pay for maintenance. Even if they're scrapped, it still costs a lot of money. On the other hand, they're more profitable by giving them to us. After all, they're not giving them away for free and we still have to work for them. But those are gargoyles, my lord. In the early years in Erwin, if any noble had a gargoyle as a guard in their castle, it would be an incomparably glorious thing. It's incredible that we have so many at once. Amandina could hardly imagine that these things were just junk that Brando said the Buga were eager to get rid of. It was as if until this moment she had a direct understanding of the power of the legendary Silver Kingdom. Of course, she also had a stronger understanding of her lord's exorbitant demands. If it were her, she would never dare to ask the Buga for such an exorbitant price. But in fact, compared to these things, Brando was more concerned about the small deal at the end. He hoped that Tanya would come forward to help him collect some special materials that Valhalla urgently needed. In terms of the richness of collections in the world, there was probably no one who could compare to the white-bearded wizards of the Silver Alliance. It took a while for Amandina to recover from her dizziness. She rubbed her forehead and asked in a low voice, My lord, where shall we go next? Brando nodded. Cruz's people gave us trouble, so we naturally have to give them some trouble, he replied. Let's go see Prince Leneret. The two left the side hall one after the other. Behind them, Prince Haruz was about to follow but was grabbed by the arm. The little prince looked back at Medusa Lysimeka, who grabbed him in confusion and asked, Sister Lysimeka, what's the matter? Lysimeka put a finger to her lips and gestured for him to be quiet. She hissed and whispered, That count as your teacher? Haruz nodded. Does he support you to be king? Haruz shook his head. I don't want to be king, Sister Lysimeka, but don't tell my sister, she'll scold me. Well, little one, Lysimeka patted his little head. Whether you want to be king or not, you must hold on tight to your teacher. In your little country, I'm afraid no one can be more capable than him. What's the matter, Sister Lysimeka? Haruz was a little puzzled. Nothing, Lysimeka suddenly asked. Little prince, can you let me go with you to that whatever empire? Didn't you not want to go, Sister Lysimeka? I've changed my mind. Oh, Haruz said, I think it should be okay. I can pick a few people to accompany me. I'll let Madame Wenze stay. Thank you, little one. Medusa Lysimeka licked her lips with her forked tongue and looked strangely in the direction Brando left. It's interesting to be able to command the Bugas. Chapter 900. The residence that Brando arranged for Prince Leneret was located on the east side of Valhalla, in a palace formed by hollowing out the trunk of a tree. This was one of Valhalla's abilities. As long as one paid a certain amount of mana in the town hall, the tree fortress would be able to create an unlimited number of caverns. Of course, to turn these caverns into rooms, one would need to decorate them. Brendel asked Amandina and Odin to design a palace that was modeled after Coldwood Castle to serve as Valhalla's guest rooms. Now this luxurious guest room was exclusively occupied by the eldest prince of the Cruz people. Outside the guest room, day or night, there were Cruz's folded sword knights guarding it in shifts. Most of these folded sword knights knew Brando, and after notifying him and getting Leneret's approval, they respectfully let him in. The entrance to the palace was cleverly arranged. It was located on a terrace connected by a vine path, the other end of the path connected to the second level of the treetop square above. The entrance was very remote and guarded by tree elf archers. Right in front of the terrace was the main branch of the giant tree that extended upward. In that direction, there were tree elf archers' outposts and tree houses hidden between the branches, but through the lush shade on both sides of the branches, one could still see the scenery of the mountains and the clouds to the east. It could be said that both safety and the owner of the place could enjoy the wonderful scenery. It was an excellent design. At the entrance, there were vines full of green leaves hanging down from the tree wall, as if forming a curtain. Behind it was the main hall of the palace. This main hall was also half open. There was a giant crystal above the hall that could filter the light from the outside, allowing sunlight or moonlight to pour on the magic fountain in the center of the hall, allowing the sparkling spring water to gush over the pebbles. When Brando and Amandina walked into the hall, they happened to see the eldest prince of the Cruz people standing by the spring, looking down at the sparkling golden water flow, thinking about something. Your Highness Leneret, are you satisfied with your stay? Brando walked to a place not far from him and stopped to greet him. Leneret looked back at them and nodded, but did not answer, only waiting for them to speak. This guy is still as boring as ever, Bu thought. He took the initiative to speak. Your Highness Leneret, the Wind Elves have started a war in the wilderness of the Four Realms, and the Golden Mane Lion Men are also gathering an army. The Holy War can be said to have begun. I wonder what your Highness thinks about this? Since the start of the Holy War, the Silver Queen had no choice but to rely heavily on the military nobles in the Empire, and most of these nobles supported the eldest son of the Emperor. Leneret nodded silently and asked, according to the usual practice, the Holy Cathedral of Fire should have summoned the envoys of various countries to Rushta. I haven't had the time to congratulate Mr. Count on being appointed as the head of the envoy group. His Highness Leneret has also lived in Tanajul for some time. He wouldn't not want to return to the Empire, would he? The eldest son of the Cruz people raised his head and looked at him with light blue eyes. That indifferent gaze seemed to say, could it be that you, a little Count of Tanajul, also want to intervene in the battle for the throne of the Empire? Brando spread his hands and smiled slightly. Your Highness, it's not that I want to pull chestnuts out of the fire, but I have no choice. I have no intention of intervening in the internal affairs of the Cruz people, especially the most troublesome battle for the throne. But now that things have come to this, I have to think of a way to protect myself. This matter is good for you and good for me, so I would like to get some advice from you. What advice? Leneret asked. First of all, I want to know in the Empire who will spare no effort to support you. Leneret frowned slightly as if considering the value of this meeting. After a moment of consideration, he gestured to Brando. The gesture meant, please come inside and talk, and then turned and walked in the direction of the study. Brendel seemed to have expected this, and he brought Amandina along to follow them. They went all the way to the study. There were a few light spirits in the study waiting for the eldest son's instructions. Leneret asked them to set up the room and put black tea and snacks. Although these light spirits also listened to Brando's orders, Brando was good-natured and waited for the eldest son of the Cruz people to exercise his authority, although his authority was also limited to this palace. A moment later, when a few light spirits flew out of the room, the eldest son of the Cruz people solemnly replied, "Mr. Count, the Octavier family is my wife's family, and Duke Ludwig will spare no effort to support me." Brando really did not expect the eldest son of the emperor to already have a wife at such a young age. However, this kind of political marriage in Wand was equivalent to taking sides. The Octavier family could be said to be tied to Lenoret for good or ill, so Duke Ludwig in the Cruz Empire could be regarded as the kind of person that the eldest son of the emperor could completely trust. "What else?" he continued to ask. "The Nona family is my ally." "What's going on?" Brando asked. "Old Marquis Inoan had publicly opposed the succession of the late king to my mother, so he had a grudge with my mother. This kind of hatred will not be resolved with the passage of time, so the most eager to have my mother abdicate is the Nona family. I have a secret agreement with the Nona family, and Marquis Inoan promised to give me a portion of Inoan's mining shares and unreservedly support me in seizing the throne." Lenoret replied calmly. Brando suddenly understood. No wonder Mangrove was in such a hurry to come from the Empire to Tanajul. The Empire's army was divided into four, and the current Marquis Inoan Mangrove was the commander of the Black Legion. In addition, the Azure Legion was in the hands of the Arahik family behind Veronica. The Nigel family, which was related to the royal family by blood, controlled the White Legion on the border of Hazel and the Red Legion on the border of Saint Tassel. These three families were the typical representatives of the military aristocracy in the north. The attitude of these military aristocrats was generally biased towards the eldest son of the emperor's succession, but this only represented one attitude. According to Lenoret's words, the only one who was really willing to contribute should be the Nona family. Brando noted this point and continued to ask, "Anything else?" "The old Prime Minister Nidevan." "Prime Minister Nidevan?" Brando was shocked and asked again almost in disbelief. The old Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire, Nidevan, was not an ordinary person. He should be more than 150 years old now, and was an elder of the empire for 3 generations. 100 years ago, it was with his help that the Emperor of Cruz regained power from the Holy Cathedral. If there was any legend of the people of Cruz in this era, it should be the Prime Minister. And with his identity and wisdom, or to put it bluntly, such an old fox, how could he easily choose a side? Brando looked at the eldest son of the Cruz Empire suspiciously, and Lenoret replied slowly, "Mother's favor to the Palette family is actually to use the power of the local aristocrats to suppress other forces in the court. The military aristocrats in the north rarely intervene in government affairs, so her purpose is known to the world, nothing more than the Prime Minister and the Holy Cathedral. The Prime Minister understands that Mother has no good feelings for him, so naturally he will not stand on that side. But he may not stand on your side either." Brando thought to himself that the Empire had plenty of princes and princesses, and it was not to the extent that there would be no heir just because of the loss of the eldest son. However, the eldest son was at least right about one thing, and that was that no matter which prince or princess was chosen to inherit the empire, the old Prime Minister would not stand on the side of the Silver Queen. That was enough. He silently calculated that the 3 forces mentioned by Lenoret came from the distant relatives of the royal family, the military aristocrats and the general aristocrats. The most hardcore of them should be Duke Ludwig of the Octavier family, followed by the Nona family. The old Prime Minister Nidevan could only be regarded as a potential ally, or rather, an enemy. Brando still remembered that he had offended the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire, the precious granddaughter of the old Prime Minister, so he would try not to provoke her if he could. On the surface, there were several forces in the Cruz Empire: the royal family, the military aristocrats, the local aristocrats, and the Holy Sanctum. These 4 forces basically controlled most of the empire's land, population, resources, and army. The empire's land, population, and resources were of little significance to Brando. The most important thing for his plan was the army. In the empire's army, the 4 traditional legions were controlled by the military aristocrats, and the royal family controlled 2 of them through marriage. The patrolling cavalry and local garrison forces in various areas had always been the traditional sphere of influence of the local aristocrats, including the newly risen navy. However, the local aristocrats were divided into 2, with the royal family and the Holy Sanctum each occupying one of them. The royal family was more closely related to the autonomous grand duchies in the north, while the Holy Sanctum mainly influenced the small and large lords in the south. Finally, the Holy Sanctum itself also had a military force that could not be underestimated, including the most elite part of the Cruz army, such as the bishops and the Flame family knights. Brando thought about it and suddenly realized that he had missed something. What about Veronica? Shouldn't she also support His Royal Highness? He raised his head and asked Lenoret this question somewhat strangely. The eldest prince of the Cruz Empire glanced at him and shook his head. Mr. Count, the teacher supports me because of the honor and sense of justice of the military, but the Arizic family behind the teacher may not stand on my side. Brando understood what was going on after hearing this, and he could not help but be in awe. The names mentioned by Lenoret before, including the military aristocrats in the north, could at most be called qualified politicians, but this female legion commander was a real soldier and knight of the empire. He tapped his knuckles and began to analyze while replying to Lenoret. I have probably understood, Your Royal Highness. Let's now determine what our goal is. In Brando's heart, what he most wanted to see was, of course, the prince returning directly to the empire and pulling his supporters to fight against Her Royal Highness. The slightest result of this would be a coup, but the more likely result would be a civil war. Of course, this idea was just a thought. The eldest prince was not a fool, and his supporters had not been affected by the halo of retardation. The ultimate goal of a plan depended on the power they had now. A beggar would not rashly dream of becoming a king. A farmer's long-term plan was mostly to buy a few more acres of land, not to become a wealthy merchant who could traverse the four seas. And the goal Brando set for Lenoret was self-preservation. Self-preservation. The eldest prince of the Cruz people chewed on the word carefully. Self-preservation, first ensure that my supporters in the empire will not be swept away by my mother, is that what you mean? Damn, this is a monster, Brando could not help but curse in his heart. Although he had heard about the wisdom and strength of the eldest prince in history, but when he really faced him, he could not help but feel that his IQ was crushed by the other party by several levels. He, Amandina, and Carglass had discussed this plan several times, and finally decided on the details one by one. He did not expect the other party to guess what they meant just by hearing the name. The Silver Queen had set such a grand goal of unifying Wond, and what she had to do was to gather the army first. It was conceivable that she would definitely start with the Nona family first, and she had previously suppressed the northern nobles in preparation for this day. The military nobles were not fools, and naturally understood the principle that if one were to prosper, all would prosper, and if one were to suffer, all would suffer. The only way Her Majesty could deal with them was to use the peaceful period to reduce the army and the power in the hands of these nobles. But the early arrival of the Holy War forced the Silver Queen to let go of the restraints on the northern nobles, because she knew very well that she still had many opponents in the empire. If she lost in the Holy War, then these opponents hiding in the dark would jump out together to force her to abdicate. She had been in the empire for 40 years, and according to the previous agreement, she should have abdicated long ago. If she wanted to continue to rule this huge empire, she had to increase her prestige and give herself a legitimate reason not to leave. The best reason was that she could lead the people of Cruz to victory. And this was the opportunity for Brando and the eldest son of the emperor. But at this time, not only could they not stand up against the Supreme One, but they also had to restrain themselves and try not to give her a chance to make mistakes. On the surface, the only army that Lenoret could control was the Black Legion, plus the local noble forces that Duke Dugweg could influence in the north. But in fact, the Silver Queen could not control too many troops, only the Red and White Legions. But compared to the eldest son of the emperor, she had more potential enemies. She was on bad terms with the Kirk family, the Holy Cathedral, and the Prime Minister. The Arizico family was said to be very close to the Flower Leaf territory, so they would not be determined to support Her Majesty. On the contrary, although they were not loyal allies of the eldest son of the emperor, there was no shortage of opportunities to turn enemies into friends, because at least they had a common enemy. Brando's proposal to Lenoret was to first secretly connect his forces in the country in his name to help each other, and then hide deep in the dark. This was a means of self-protection. Self-protection itself was a kind of defense, but defense was also for counterattack. This holy war was an indescribable whirlpool for the Cruz Empire. The Holy Cathedral wanted to win, and the Silver Queen also wanted to win, but the Holy Cathedral was not willing to make a wedding dress for the Silver Queen, and presumably the Supreme One of the Empire had the same idea. And the local nobles also had their own ulterior motives. There were hardcore supporters of the Queen, and there were also supporters of the Holy Cathedral. When the two sides wrestled with each other, the power owned by the eldest son of the emperor became a decisive force. If he chose to remain silent, then the Silver Queen's plan to integrate the power of the empire to achieve military victory in the Holy War could be said to have failed by half. In the face of this situation, it was not surprising that the old Prime Minister, Naidivan, would look on coldly, and the attitude of the local nobles would change over time. Because of a very simple principle. A newly ascended emperor and an iron-blooded queen who had ruled the empire for 40 years had a completely different power in terms of governing ability. No local nobles would like an overly powerful emperor. This was a universal truth in Wand, so it was self-evident who they would eventually side with. When the prestige of Her Majesty the Queen weakened day by day with the deepening of the war, then the voices forcing her to abdicate would one day reach a consensus among all the nobles. At that time, Leneret could justifiably return to the empire and receive the support of the nobles. This was the final counterattack. Of course, self-protection at this stage was also good for Brando. He wanted to go to the empire to take back the Azure Lance and Scarlet, and it was conceivable that his enemies should be Her Majesty the Queen and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Therefore, the last thing he wanted to see was a completely unified empire, whether under the name of the Silver Queen or the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, what he had to do was to maintain the chaotic status quo of the empire and seek opportunities for himself with the help of the opposition from many sides. At the same time, Leneret's allies in the north could also provide him with the necessary protection, such as arranging a safe channel for him to escape the empire. In this regard, he and the eldest son of the Kurlutzians had common interests. Leneret listened carefully to Amandina's analysis and nodded silently. He finally looked at Brando and his gaze was no longer so cold. He thought for a moment before he replied, "Count, thank you for your frank proposal. I think I can trust you completely. If one day I ascend the throne, then your friendship with me today will become a precious witness." Brando smiled slightly and finally breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. "Then it's a pleasure to work with you, Your Highness," he replied. Leneret nodded slightly to him as a sign of acknowledgement, but his stern face did not loosen in the slightest. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, "As a friend, I have some personal advice that I can tell you, Count." Brando was slightly taken aback and asked, "What advice?" "I know my mother's character and conduct very well. Your subordinate is in her hands and she will definitely use you and Erwin to coerce her into submission. I think, Count, if your subordinate's inner world is not very indestructible, you'd better do something to give her some confidence." The eldest prince replied faintly. Sure enough, His Royal Highness already knew the real reason why he came here. Brando thought in his heart, but he immediately realized that the information provided by Prince Leneret was very deceptive. He thought for a moment and felt that with Her Majesty's character of not giving up until she achieved her goal, she would most likely do so. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that his trip was not a loss. He hurriedly nodded to the eldest prince of the Cruz people. "I understand what to do, thank you very much." Correction, yesterday's scene 55 should be scene 56. Today I will release the first chapter, scene 57, and there will be another one later. I hope everyone will enjoy it, and I also hope everyone will support me and spend more monthly votes. Chapter 901. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflund couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In Abes, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trendheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Erwin, and most of them were here for the first time in Tanajul. They were here for only one purpose: to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for Abes Castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire was nominally headed by Brando, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be a fixed number of seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were what Brando couldn't designate. Among them there was a representative of the royal family, and Prince Haruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 nannies of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Haruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimachia at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, Erwin's former royal family, the Cipher royal family, should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere Seal for a week or 2 to meet them here. Her Royal Highness's brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen the candidate, and that the envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the count didn't have to worry too much. Then, for dukes, Viro, Grimoires, Lantanailan, Karsuk, and 3 counts, Count Genelasu, Count Yenbao, and Count Grey Mountain, plus a Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. There were originally supposed to be representatives of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed, and they were both part of the royal family's territory and part of Tanajul. Erech's family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere Seal, they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still in prison in Magiton, so naturally, it was impossible for them to send any representatives. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter, Duke Talanalan's envoy Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grimoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Genelasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Count of Grey Mountain also did not come to Tanajul, so naturally he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a little twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilfrey decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. First, she could leave an impression on the Holy Cathedral of Fire as the future successor of Yenbao, and second, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people and 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadal. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to Cruz. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to Cruz. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tanajul and was not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him. She was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando, I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Besides, you don't seem to remember, I told you to stay in Tanajul obediently and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, do you understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. Wait, Brando suddenly froze in place. He reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh, damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "No." Little Roman blew a puff of white air on his hand and replied with a smile, "I'm the rightful one." "Justified my ass." Brando pinched her face. Listen to me obediently, stay in Tanajil, you're not allowed to go anywhere. Brendel pinched Romaine's cheeks for a long time, but she kept waving her hands trying to break free from his grip, but her mouth did not loosen. He could not help but become a little suspicious. This was not in line with her temperament. He could not help but let go of his hand and asked doubtfully, "All right, tell me, what exactly are you going to do in the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. It was true that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars from various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebrations or ceremonies of the opening of the Holy War. But he never dreamed that Roman, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancée, would be on the list. He couldn't help but read the letter over and over again several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing did not look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. "When did your business become so big?" "Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to amp your seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all." The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least, Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tanajil's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head, still thinking that Amandina had used to cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. "Can I go now, Brando?" The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. "Up to you." Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancée of his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. "Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use with a stove that can put charcoal on it." "No, go to my carriage obediently." "Oh." After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. When he saw the elder of the Wild Elf sisters, he knew that the things she had prepared were probably done, and hurriedly greeted her. "Ferlin." "My lord. Are Brunhilde and the others ready?" The elder of the Wild Elf sisters nodded. "Very good." Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Griffine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group, and even appointed him as the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tanajil to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, The empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies, and this had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the empire. This in itself represented a respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their allegiance to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant, and appeared to be a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war and even after. The guards of this envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, the guards of these envoys would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely resulted in bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The strongest group of guards of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be the guards of the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time they sent a guard composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Erewhon people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent by the Erewhon people could be said to be the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tulman. With just these two people they swept away everyone including Cruz's people. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Erewhon, and Tanajil was now the strongest territory in the entire Erewhon Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando to be the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for why these people would go to Cruz in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in Cruz." At the end he added in a low voice, "Holy War. Holy War, here I come." I hope that everyone can spend as much as they can on the monthly votes as they can, so that they can get the inspiration and motivation to write. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.